Hi guys, welcome to the Quiet Past Historical Channel. Tonight you're stepping into something quiet, not the war itself, not the guns, not the marching, not the dates and battles you may have heard before. Tonight you're stepping into something far more subtle, something that happened in the background, almost without anyone noticing, while the world was busy tearing itself apart. Tonight you're stepping into the long, slow, almost invisible aftermath of a war that nobody planned, that almost nobody wanted, and that almost everyone believed would be over by Christmas. It was not over by Christmas, and the world that survived it, the world that crawled out of the mud in the silence, was not the same world that had walked so confidently into it. The clothes were different, the food was different. The way people spoke to each other, the way they thought about their bodies and their governments and their futures, all of it quietly, permanently changed. And most of the people living through those changes did not even notice they were happening. So tonight we slow down, we take our time. We sit beside the fire in the years before, during, and after the First World War, and we simply watch. We watch what people ate for breakfast, what they wore on a Tuesday morning, what they thought about when they could not sleep. We watch the small, ordinary corners of a world in the middle of its first great transformation. There is no rush tonight. The story is long and it is patient and it will wait for you. Come in, sit down, let's begin. A gentle note before we begin, before we move forward into this story, a small and quiet invitation. If you find yourself settling in tonight, if the pace of this feels like something you want more of, consider subscribing to the channel. This is a space built entirely for calm, slow historical storytelling. New videos arrive when they are ready, not before. There is no rush here either. And now, truly, we begin. The world before the war, Europe, 1900-1914. A slow morning before a long day. To understand how the First World War changed everything, you first have to understand what everything looked like before. And the best way to do that, the most honest and useful way, is not to look at kings and treaties. It is to look at an ordinary morning. A Tuesday morning, say, in the early years of the 20th century, sometime around 1908 or perhaps 1910, before the assassinations, before the ultimatums, before the trains full of soldiers began to move. Let's say it is a Tuesday morning in a city, London perhaps, or Vienna, or Paris, or Berlin. Any one of these would serve our purposes, because in many ways in the years before the war, these cities were more similar to each other than they would ever be again. The morning begins with sound, as mornings always do. The sound of hooves on cobblestone. Not yet the sound of engines, not entirely, though the first automobiles are beginning to appear, rattling and steaming through the wider streets, startling horses and pedestrians alike. But mostly, in the early morning, it is still horses. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, pulling carts full of bread and coal and vegetables through the gray-blue light of a European city before sunrise. If you were standing on a street corner in London in 1910, you would notice the smell before almost anything else. Coal smoke, horse manure, bread baking somewhere nearby, wet wool, the particular mineral sharpness of cobblestone streets after a night of rain. The air of a pre-war European city was thick with smells, most of which modern people have no reference for at all. The city wakes up in layers. First, the men who light things, the lamplighters, already finished with their morning work, walking home with their long poles over their shoulders. Then the delivery men. Then the shopkeepers, rolling up their awnings, arranging their windows, sweeping their small patches of pavement with wide brooms that make a soft, rhythmic shushing sound against the stone. Then the workers. Millions of them in every major European city: factory workers, clerks, seamstresses, porters, waiters, drivers, printers, teachers, nurses, shopgirls, telegraph operators. The middle and working classes of Europe, moving through their morning routines with the particular purposefulness of people who know exactly where they are going and approximately what the day will bring. And what does a morning routine look like in 1910? For a working-class family in London, it begins very early. 5 o'clock, sometimes earlier. The father rises first, in a bedroom that is cold because the coal fire has gone out overnight and has not yet been relit. He dresses by the dim light of a candle or a small oil lamp. Gaslight has reached most city streets, but many working-class interiors are still lit by flame. He puts on clothes that are almost identical to the clothes he wore yesterday and the day before. A collarless shirt, braces, heavy trousers. Thick boots that he keeps near the door so they are easy to find in the dark. He eats before he leaves. Almost always porridge, or bread with dripping, the fat skimmed from a roasting pan, spread on bread like butter because butter is more expensive. A cup of tea, very strong with a great deal of sugar. Sugar is cheap in 1910, cheaper than it has ever been in human history, and the working classes of Britain consume it in extraordinary quantities, in their tea, in their puddings, in their jam, in their condensed milk. The children sleep a little longer if they are lucky, which in many households they are not. Mothers begin their morning before the children are even fully awake, lighting the fire, heating water, preparing breakfast, getting the smaller children dressed while the older ones dress themselves with varying degrees of success. This is the morning of a working-class European family in the years before the First World War. and it has changed very little in the past century. The same routines, the same foods, the same rhythms that their parents and grandparents would have recognized without difficulty. But for another family, a middle-class family, say in Vienna or Paris, the morning looks quite different and yet also deeply familiar. The apartment is larger. There's running water, cold water, fed by pipes, available from a tap in the kitchen and perhaps a smaller tap in the bathroom. There may be a gas stove for cooking, a remarkable modern convenience that the housewife demonstrates to her guests with quiet pride. The children have a nursery. There is a maid, a young woman from the countryside, living in the household, earning a small wage in her meals. Breakfast here is a more elaborate affair. Coffee or chocolate, not tea. Bread rolls, soft and freshly baked, brought each morning from the bakery around the corner. Perhaps cold meats or a soft boiled egg in a small porcelain cup. The newspapers arrive with the rolls, and the father of the household reads them at the table while his wife manages the children. The newspapers in 1910, in any of these great European cities, are full of the things that newspapers are always full of: politics, trade, crime, theater reviews, society gossip, sporting results, foreign dispatches. There are stories about Germany's growing naval power, about tensions in the Balkans, about the assassination attempts and the unrest that seem always to be simmering somewhere at the edges of the empire. But these stories sit beside advertisements for patent medicines and summer resorts and ladies' fashions from Paris, and they do not feel, on a Tuesday morning in 1910, like the beginning of anything particularly catastrophic, because the people reading these newspapers in 1910 are, in many ways, the most optimistic generation in European history. They have lived through an extraordinary half-century. The century that is just ending, the 19th century, the long Victorian age, has brought things that their grandparents would have considered magic. Trains that cross continents in days, steamships that cross oceans in a week, the telegraph which sends words through copper wires at the speed of lightning, the telephone, the phonograph, the motion picture, electric light, aspirin, the appendix operation, the beginning of flight. There is a word that the educated classes of Europe use a great deal in these years, a French word, progress. The idea that things are getting better, steadily and inevitably and almost automatically, that the future will be more comfortable, more enlightened, more peaceful than the past, that science and reason and trade are gradually solving the problems that have plagued humanity since the beginning, and they have evidence for this belief, real, solid evidence. Life expectancy in most Western European countries has risen dramatically over the past 50 years. Child mortality, while still high by modern standards, has fallen significantly. Real wages for working people have been rising steadily. More children are going to school. More people can read. More people have enough to eat most of the time. Even the wars have been getting smaller and shorter, or so it seems. The last major European conflict, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, lasted less than a year. The wars since then have been fought at the edges of empire, in Africa and Asia, not in the cities of Europe themselves. The great powers have a system, a network of treaties and alliances and diplomatic understandings that is supposed to prevent any dispute from escalating into something truly catastrophic. This system, they believe, works because it has to work. Because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. And so the newspapers are read, and the breakfast rolls are eaten, and the children are dressed and sent to school, and the father takes his hat from the hook by the door and walks to work through the morning streets of his city, and the trams run on their tracks, and the horses pull their carts, and the smoke rises from 1,000 chimneys, and the whole great machine of European civilization hums along in its accustomed grooves, and nobody, or almost nobody, thinks that anything is about to change. But in a small, sunlit office in Sarajevo, a young man is writing a letter, and in a chancellery in Berlin, a general is consulting a map, and in a farmhouse in the Austrian countryside, a man named Franz Ferdinand is planning his summer schedule. The morning goes on, the city breathes, the clocks tick, and the world, without knowing it, is about to take the last step before everything changes. Now, to understand what happens next, and more importantly, to understand what it all means, we should spend a little more time in this pre-war world, because it is a world that is about to disappear, and many of the people living in it will not realize it has disappeared until long after it is already gone. Let's talk about what people wore, because clothing, in any era, tells you almost everything. The way people dress reflects what they think about themselves, about their bodies, about their place in society, about what they owe to others and what others owe to them. And the clothing of 1910 is, in retrospect, one of the most revealing things about the world that the First World War was about to transform. Let's begin with women, because the changes in women's clothing over this period are, arguably, the most dramatic transformation in the history of human dress. In 1910, a respectable woman, middle class, urban educated, does not leave her home without a corset. This is not a small thing. A corset in 1910 is not a decorative undergarment. It is a structural device. It is made of whalebone or steel, stitched into heavy cotton or linen, and laced tightly at the back, and it compresses a woman's torso from just below the bust to well below the hips. It changes the shape of her body. It pushes her chest forward and her hips back, creating the characteristic S-curve silhouette of the Edwardian era, a posture that is, from a modern medical perspective, distinctly unhealthy, but which is, in 1910, considered the natural and proper shape of a woman. Women have been wearing corsets in various forms for several centuries. Their grandmothers wore them. Their mothers wore them. They have always worn them, or cannot remember a time when they did not. Putting on a corset in the morning is as unremarkable to a woman of 1910 as putting on a bra would be to a woman of the 1980s. It is simply part of getting dressed. On top of the corset goes a chemise, a petticoat, and then the dress itself, which in 1910 comes in a variety of styles depending on the occasion and the hour of day, but which in almost all cases covers most of the body. The hem is at or near the ankle. The sleeves, except for the very warmest summer weather, extend to the wrist. The neckline is high. The overall effect is of a great deal of fabric carefully arranged. Over the dress goes a hat, always a hat outdoors always. The hats of 1910 are extraordinary. They are wide, often enormously wide, piled high with ribbons and artificial flowers, and in some cases, entire taxidermied birds. They are pinned to the hair with long hat pins, whose pointed ends protrude far enough from the hat that they are considered a genuine public safety hazard in crowded trams and omnibuses. All of this takes time. Getting dressed in the morning, for a woman of 1910 with the full complement of correct clothing, takes the better part of an hour. Dressing for an evening occasion takes considerably longer, and if the hair must be arranged as well, which it must, elaborate updos being very much in fashion, a lady's maid may be employed simply to assist with the daily ritual of getting presentable. Men's clothing in 1910 is slightly less encumbering but no less prescriptive. A middle-class man in the city wears a suit, almost always a suit, consisting of jacket, waistcoat, and matching trousers. The suit is dark-colored, navy or charcoal or black, because dark suits do not show the inevitable coal dust and street dirt as readily as lighter colors. Over the suit goes a stiff collar, detachable, starched white, fastened with collar studs and a tie. On the head almost always a hat. For business, a bowler or a Homburg. For formal occasions, a top hat. The collar deserves a moment's attention, because it is one of those small details that reveals a great deal. Stiff white collar is, by 1910, the universal mark of middle-class respectability for men. Working-class men wear collarless shirts. Men in certain artistic or bohemian circles wear soft, turned-down collars. But the man who works in an office, who handles money or papers or ledgers, who serves as a clerk or a manager or a professional of any kind, he wears the stiff white collar every day without fail. And the stiff white collar is genuinely uncomfortable. It chafes the neck. It restricts movement. It must be detached at the end of each working day and sent to the laundress, who returns it starched to the appropriate stiffness. Keeping the collar clean and white is a constant, low-level logistical challenge. And yet it is endured without complaint because this is what respectability requires. This is the clothing of 1910. This is the costume of a civilization at the height of its confidence, about to walk, without knowing it, into the thing that would change everything. Now let's look at what people ate. The diet of a pre-war European is, again, very different from what we eat today, and the differences are not always what you might expect. In some ways, the pre-war diet is more wholesome than what came after. People eat more locally. They eat more seasonally. They eat things that are in season and available in their region, because refrigeration is limited and long-distance transportation of perishable food is still relatively recent. In the summer, there are fresh vegetables and fruits in great abundance, because they are cheap and they are there. In the winter, there are stored vegetables, root vegetables mostly, potatoes and turnips and carrots and parsnips, preserved vegetables, dried pulses, smoked and salted meats. There is a great deal of bread. In almost every European country and social class, bread is the foundation of the diet, eaten at every meal, in quantities that would seem extraordinary to a modern person. White bread is preferred by those who can afford it. Brown bread, made from less refined flour, is what working people eat when they cannot afford better, and they eat it without particular enthusiasm. Meat is the prestige food of 1910, as it has been for centuries. The wealthy eat meat at every meal: beef, lamb, game, poultry, fish. The middle classes eat meat several times a week. Working-class families eat meat when they can afford it, which for many means only on Sundays, and the piece of meat that appears at Sunday dinner is a significant domestic event, planned in advance, purchased with care, cooked for hours, and consumed with a seriousness that reflects its importance. The Sunday joint, a piece of roast beef or lamb or pork, is one of the great institutions of working-class British life in this period. It is the center of the week's food. The leftovers appear on Monday as cold meat, on Tuesday as hash or shepherd's pie, on Wednesday in a soup made from the bone, until by Thursday there is nothing left and the household is back to bread and dripping and whatever else can be managed until the next Sunday. The great working-class foods of this era are things that have almost disappeared from modern tables: tripe and onions, stewed eels, faggots, brawn, pickled herring, suet pudding, spotted dick, bread pudding. These are foods designed to be filling, cheap, and hot. They are not fashionable foods. They are not glamorous, but they are the foods that keep millions of people going through long working days, and they are eaten with appreciation and without apology. In France and Germany and Austria, the diet varies, but the general logic is the same: bread, vegetables, some meat, preserved foods for winter. The French have their bread and their wine and their slow-cooked stews. The Germans have their rye bread and their sausages and their potato dishes. The Austrians have their dumplings and their roast pork and their extraordinary cakes and pastries. The pastry culture of Vienna in the years before the war is worth pausing on, because it represents something that the war will damage in ways that are hard to fully recover from. The coffee houses of Vienna, the great, warm marble and mirror establishments where gentlemen spend entire afternoons over a single cup of coffee and a slice of cake, are one of the high watermarks of pre-war European civilization. The coffee house is not just a place to drink coffee. It is a combination of office, library, social club, and theater. You pay for your coffee, but what you are really paying for is the table. And the table in a Viennese coffee house comes with newspapers from a dozen different cities, an unlimited supply of water, a coat hook, and the implicit understanding that you may sit for as many hours as you like without being hurried out. Sigmund Freud sits in coffee houses. Arthur Schnitzler sits in coffee houses. Leon Trotsky, before the revolution, sits in coffee houses, arguing about the future of socialism while the waiter brings him another glass of water. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, formulates his ideas in the coffee houses of Vienna and Paris. The coffee house is where ideas happen, slowly, over cake and cigarettes and long afternoons of conversation. This is the world of 1910, unhurried in many ways. Deeply stratified by class, but within each class possessed of a particular comfort, particular rhythm. The trams run on schedule. The bread arrives fresh each morning. The coffee house opens at 8 and closes at midnight. The Sunday joint goes in the oven at 11 and comes out at 1, and the clocks tick on. Now let's talk about how people travel, because transportation, the way people and goods move through the world, is one of the things that the war will change most dramatically. In 1910, most ordinary people do not travel very far, very often. This is a simple fact that is easy to underestimate if you have grown up in a world of cheap airline tickets and motorways. In 1910, for the average working person, the world is relatively small. They live and work within a radius of a few miles. They may travel by tram or omnibus to their workplace. They may travel by train to the seaside once a year, for the annual summer holiday if they can afford it. Beyond that, they mostly stay in their neighborhood, their city, their region. Long-distance travel is for the wealthy and the professional classes. A businessman travels between cities on the excellent train networks that crisscross Europe. A middle-class family might take the express train from Paris to the Swiss Alps for a summer holiday, sitting in first or second-class compartments upholstered in red velvet, watching the landscape change through the large plate glass windows. A diplomat or an aristocrat might travel across Europe and beyond, staying in grand hotels whose lobbies are full of potted palms and uniformed porters. The trains of 1910 are remarkable machines. The great express trains, the Orient Express, the Blue Train, the Fletch Door, are mobile palaces, offering their first-class passengers dining cars with silver cutlery and crystal glasses, sleeping compartments with fold-down beds and private wash basins, and smoking rooms paneled in polished wood where gentlemen discuss business and politics over brandy and cigars. Third class is considerably less luxurious: wooden benches, no heat or inadequate heat. The smell of coal smoke and many people in a confined space, but it is still, by historical standards, remarkable. You can travel from London to Edinburgh in 8 hours. You can travel from Vienna to Paris in a day and a half. The railways have genuinely compressed the map of Europe, and even third-class passengers can feel the miracle of it. The automobile is beginning to appear, but it is still very much a rich person's toy. In 1910, there are perhaps 500,000 motorcars in Britain, and the vast majority of them are owned by wealthy enthusiasts who enjoy the thrill of speed and the prestige of the thing. The motor car requires a driver who can manage its mechanical complexities, and a chauffeur who can maintain it, and roads that are at least somewhat adequate, and most importantly, a great deal of money to purchase and run. The roads are not, in 1910, designed for motor cars. They are designed for horses, and they have been designed for horses for centuries, and in many rural areas they are little more than dirt tracks that turn to mud in the rain and dust in the summer. The great Roman roads still run straight across Britain, but they are several hundred years overdue for resurfacing. And so, for most people, most of the time, the world moves at the speed of a horse. This will change. The war will change it in ways we will explore. But for now, in the long Tuesday morning of 1910, the horse is still the primary engine of the world's daily commerce, and the sound of hooves on cobblestone is still the sound of civilization going about its business. The guns of August, summer 1914. The world walks in. Let us not dwell long on the war itself. That is not what this story is about. But we must pass through it, the way you pass through a hallway to reach the room you were looking for. The hallway here is 4 years long and filled with a darkness that is difficult to look at directly, even at this distance of more than 100 years. The war begins in the summer of 1914, in July and August, with a speed that surprises almost everyone. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28 sets off a chain of diplomatic events that moves through July like a slow fire, visible to those who know what to look for, invisible to those who are on holiday. And many people are on holiday. July is summer, and summer in Europe means the annual migration of the middle and upper classes to the mountains and the seaside. The beaches of England are full. The Swiss hotels are full. The Adriatic resorts are full. Prime ministers are in Scotland hunting. Ministers are in France on yachts. The Kaiser is on his yacht in the North Sea. The ordinary machinery of European diplomacy is running at half speed because many of the operators are in places where they cannot easily be reached. The crisis accelerates while the diplomats are packing their bags to come home from their holidays, and by the time they get home, it is almost too late. By the end of July, the great powers are mobilizing. This is the word that echoes through the archives of that summer: mobilizing, calling up the reserves. Issuing orders to the railway managers, who have spent years preparing for exactly this moment, whose plans are printed in great sealed books that are now, finally, being opened. The mobilization plans of 1914 are, in retrospect, one of the great mechanical tragedies of history. They are masterpieces of organizational planning that, once begun, cannot easily be stopped. The railway timetables that move millions of men from their homes to the frontiers are precise to the hour, and changing them mid-course would create a chaos that the generals consider unacceptable. And so, once set in motion, the mobilizations roll forward with the terrible momentum of things that have already begun. Across Europe, in the first weeks of August 1914, millions of men say goodbye. They say goodbye in railway stations, these men. They say goodbye to their wives and their mothers and their children and their sweethearts. The platforms are crowded with people and luggage and noise, and in many cases, flowers, because in August 1914, many people believe that the war will be short and exciting and victorious, and that the men leaving on the trains will be back by Christmas. The men on the platforms are wearing their everyday clothes because the uniforms are being issued at the mobilization centers. Some of them are carrying small bags with a change of clothes and a razor and perhaps a book or a photograph. They look in the photographs taken at these railway stations, photographs that survive in archives and history books, like men who are going on a difficult but temporary journey, not like men who are walking into the most destructive event in human history up to that point. The trains depart, the platforms empty, the women go home, and the war begins. The Western Front, the line of trenches that stretches from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a distance of roughly 500 miles, forms in the autumn of 1914, after the initial German advance through Belgium and France is halted at the Battle of the Marne. The armies dig in. They dig, and the trenches grow deeper and more elaborate, and they fill up with water in the rain and freeze solid in the winter, and the men inside them crouch and wait and try to stay alive. The trench is, physically, one of the most miserable environments human beings have ever inhabited. This is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is a statement of simple fact, supported by an extraordinary quantity of personal testimony, letters, diaries, memoirs, medical records, that has been preserved and studied and reread ever since. The trench smells, first of all. This is something that is hard to convey in photographs or in polished historical prose, but it is the first thing that every man who served in the trenches mentions when he writes about his experience. The trench smells of mud, a particular mud that is not like garden mud or riverbank mud, but a churned, clay-heavy, waterlogged, chemical-laced mud that gets into everything and never entirely comes out. It smells of unwashed bodies, because water for washing is difficult to obtain and hot water for washing is essentially impossible. It smells of food, the rations that are carried up to the front in containers that are not always airtight. It smells of chemical explosives. It smells of rotting wood, because the duckboards and revetments that line the trenches rot in the constant damp. And it smells of something worse, which I will not describe in detail, except to say that latrines are not always located conveniently, and that in the heat of summer the smell carries. The men in the trenches sleep badly because the trench is always noisy and rarely warm and never comfortable. They sleep in dugouts, holes dug into the trench wall, reinforced with timber and sandbags, large enough for 3 or 4 men to lie pressed together. In winter, they sleep in their clothes, wrapped in whatever blankets are available, feet going slowly numb against the cold. In summer, they are warm but also wet, because summer in Flanders is not dry, and the mud of the salient does not dry out in summer any more than it does in any other season. They eat rations that have been cooked somewhere far behind the lines and carried to the trenches in containers that keep food warm for varying degrees of success. The standard British Army ration in the First World War is, by the standards of the time, reasonably generous: bread or hard biscuit, tinned bully beef or mackinac stew, tinned jam, margarine, sugar, and tea. The tea is very important. British soldiers drink extraordinary quantities of tea, and the organization required to keep hot tea available in the frontline trenches at all hours is one of the minor logistical achievements of the war. But rations are not always delivered on time. Sometimes the men carrying them are killed or wounded on the way up. Sometimes the containers are damaged. Sometimes the organization breaks down, as organization in war so often does, and the men in the front line go hungry for longer than is comfortable. And yet, within all of this, within the mud and the cold and the noise and the smell and the constant proximity of death, something remarkable happens. Life goes on, not in a grand or dramatic way. Not in the way that inspiring speeches and heroic films suggest, but in the small, ordinary, stubbornly persistent way that human beings have always managed to keep living even in the most extreme circumstances. Men write letters. They write to their families at home, describing what they can, the weather, their friends, the food, the small domestic details of trench life that are safe to mention without alarming anyone. They read letters sitting in dugouts by the light of small candles, reading and rereading the news from home that arrives in canvas bags carried by the postal runners. They play cards, they play drafts, they bet small amounts of money on impossible things. They make things carving wood, embroidering handkerchiefs with silk thread from the supply lines, making rings from spent cartridges, making things simply because making things is one of the ways human beings manage the unmanageable. They sing. The British Tommy in the trenches sings with a dedication that is one of the most touching details of the whole war. Marching songs, music hall songs, comic songs that make jokes about the generals and the rations and the mud. Songs that are gentle and homesick and full of longing for ordinary things. It's a long way to Tipperary. Keep the home fires burning. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag. The words of these songs heard today carry a weight that is almost painful, because we know what many of the singers did not yet know: how long the war would last, and how many of them would not come home. We must pause here and note something that will become important later. The men in the trenches are not just British men, or French men, or German men. The British Army in 1914 is the center of the largest empire in human history, and the soldiers who fight in its name come from every corner of that empire. From India, where millions of men serve under the British flag. From Australia and New Zealand, whose soldiers will die at Gallipoli in numbers that their countries have never forgotten. From Canada, from South Africa, from the Caribbean islands, from the West African coast. From every continent except Antarctica, men come to fight in the fields of France and Belgium. And on the other side, the German and Austro-Hungarian armies contain within them the enormous diversity of their own empires. Men who speak different languages, who worship in different churches and mosques and temples, who eat different foods and follow different customs, who come from places as different from each other as Vienna and the plains of Galicia, or Berlin and the mountains of Tyrol. This mixing of peoples, this collision and interaction of human beings from wildly different backgrounds, forced together by the machinery of war, is one of the things that the war does that no one planned, and one of the things that will have the most lasting consequences. When the war is over, these men go home, and they take things with them. Ideas, habits, tastes, knowledge, new words, new foods, new ways of thinking about the world. The Indian soldier who returns to Lahore after serving in France carries, in his memory, images and experiences that his neighbors cannot imagine. The Australian farmer who survives Gallipoli and the Western Front returns to Queensland a different person than the one who left. The French-speaking West African Turkolours who fight in the mud of France come home to Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire carrying in their minds the seeds of ideas that will, 30 years later, bloom into independence movements. The war is not only a military event, it is also the largest involuntary exchange of people and ideas in human history up to that point. We will come back to this, but for now, let's keep moving. The home front, what happened to the world while the men were away, while the men are in the trenches, the women are at home, and while they are at home, they are changing the world. This is not, should be said immediately, a simple or straightforward story. It is not a story of sudden liberation or overnight transformation. It is a slower story than that, more complicated, more ambivalent, but it is real and it matters, and it begins in the first weeks of August 1914 when the men leave for the trains and the factories suddenly have to figure out how to keep running without them. Before the war, the overwhelming majority of women who work for wages do so in a limited range of occupations. They are domestic servants, maids, cooks, laundresses, nursemaids working in other people's homes. They are seamstresses and textile workers, doing the fine, repetitive, low-paid work of the textile industries. They are shop assistants and clerks and teachers and nurses. They are, in other words, in women's jobs, jobs that have been designated female by custom and practice, and often by explicit policy. The great factories, the steel mills, the shipyards, the chemical plants, the munitions works, are men's territory. Heavy industry is men's work, both by physical convention and by deeply held cultural belief. Women are thought to be unsuited for the noise and danger and physical demands of factory labor, and even those who hold more progressive views tend to assume that the exclusion of women from heavy industry is practical rather than ideological. And then the men leave and the shells have to be made, and someone has to make them. The munitions factories of Britain, France, and Germany in the first months of the war face an extraordinary problem. The demand for artillery shells, the primary weapon of the war, the thing that is consumed in quantities that no one had planned for, is vastly greater than anyone anticipated. The pre-war ammunition stocks are exhausted within months. The factories must expand immediately to levels of production that are barely conceivable, and the workforce required to achieve this expansion is not available from the usual sources, because the usual sources are in France, standing in a trench, so women are hired. Not all at once and not without considerable resistance from multiple directions, from factory owners who are skeptical, from trade unions who are protective of their members' wages and conditions, from many women themselves who are uncertain about this new and disorienting thing, but hired increasingly because there is no alternative. The process is called, in the British context, dilution, the dilution of skilled male labor with unskilled female labor. It is a term that tells you something about how the process is understood at the time. The women are not replacing the men. They are watering down the workforce, supplementing it with bodies that are not quite equivalent but will do in a pinch. Within months, the women in the munitions factories are doing work that their male predecessors required years of apprenticeship to master, and they are doing it faster than the men did, in many cases, and with fewer complaints about the conditions. This is the first great surprise of the home front. The women are good at it. They are good at precise, repetitive, detail-oriented mechanical work that requires concentration and accuracy rather than raw strength, filling shells with explosive powder, operating lathes and drill presses, assembling fuses, inspecting cartridges, operating cranes and overhead hoists. The factories that once employed 10 men find they can run on 8 women and 2 men and run just as productively. This is genuinely surprising to many of the people who observe it, including some of the women themselves, because one of the things that the pre-war world believed firmly, without much examination, was that women's brains worked differently from men's in a way that made them suited for some tasks and not others. That precision engineering and mechanical reasoning were inherently male capacities. That women were naturally more suited for caring and nurturing and domestic tasks. The munitions factories of 1914, 1915, 1916 quietly demolished this belief, one shell at a time. But the factories are only part of the story. Women move into clerical work in unprecedented numbers, filling the offices of government and business that the drafted men have vacated. They become bus and tram drivers. They become postal workers. They become police officers. The Metropolitan Police in London creates its first women police patrols in 1914, initially to deal with the unescorted women who congregate around military camps. They become land workers, working on the farms that have lost their male laborers to the army. They become, in their hundreds of thousands, nurses. The nursing of the First World War is a subject that deserves, and has received, entire books of its own. The scale of it alone is staggering. Over 300,000 British women serve as military nurses during the war, in hospitals that range from purpose-built military facilities in France to converted country houses in England, from hospital ships in the Mediterranean to makeshift wards in the Middle East. The nursing of 1914 to 1918 is not the nursing of earlier wars. It is organized professional nursing, founded on the principles that Florence Nightingale established half a century earlier and expanded and systematized since then. The nursing corps of the major powers are structured, hierarchical organizations with clear training requirements, clear chains of command, and clear expectations of what nurses are expected to do and not do. But the reality of nursing in the First World War blurs those expectations considerably. A nurse in a casualty clearing station just behind the front line in France in 1916 does things that no nursing manual anticipated. She operates under bombardment. She treats wounds of a kind and scale that no peacetime hospital has prepared her for. She makes decisions in moments of crisis when no doctor is available that are technically medical decisions, the province of men with medical degrees, and she makes them correctly, and people live. She also very frequently sits with men who are dying. This is perhaps the most important thing she does and the most demanding. She's the last face that many men see, and she holds their hands and she listens to what they want to say, and sometimes she writes letters for them to the families they will never see again. This work, the work of accompanying people through the final passage of life, is work that leaves marks that do not fade easily. The women who do this work are changed by it. They are changed by the responsibility, by the exposure to suffering, by the experience of being essential and capable and trusted in ways that their pre-war lives never required of them. They are changed by what they have seen, and by what they have done, and by the knowledge, the private, unshakable knowledge that they did it. And when the war is over, they go home. And the world they go home to is not quite ready for who they have become. Let's talk about money. Because money is another thing that the war changes, in ways that we still live with today. Before the war, most of the major economies of Europe operate on the gold standard. This is a system in which the value of a country's currency is linked to a specific quantity of gold, and in which paper money can, in theory, be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate. The gold standard gives currency a kind of stability. The value of a pound or a franc or a mark is anchored to something physical, something real, something that doesn't change. The gold standard also constrains what governments can do. If you want to spend money to build an army, for instance, or to pay for a war, you have to either tax your citizens more or borrow the money or sell your gold. You cannot simply print more money because the printed money has to be backed by gold, and gold is finite. The war costs more money than anyone anticipated, much, much more. The artillery shells alone, the millions of shells that are fired in battles like the Somme and Verdun, cost more than any government's peacetime military budget, and the shells are only a fraction of the expense. There are uniforms, rations, horses, medical supplies, transport, pay for millions of men, the construction and operation of thousands of miles of railway, the building of airplanes and tanks and submarines and warships. The money has to come from somewhere. Britain raises taxes dramatically, raising the income tax rate to levels that would have seemed impossible before the war, and extending its reach to include people who had never previously paid income tax. Britain issues war bonds, borrowing from its own citizens at fixed interest, in return for promises to repay later. And Britain borrows from abroad, particularly from the United States, in amounts that mount up year after year, until by the end of the war, Britain is the world's largest debtor, having begun it as the world's largest creditor. But taxing and borrowing are not enough. All the major powers eventually do something that would have seemed financially irresponsible before the war. They print money. They suspend the gold standard quietly in the early weeks of the war when the financial panic of August 1914 threatens to drain their gold reserves. They issue notes that are not backed by gold. They create money, in a sense, from nothing, and they use this created money to pay for the war. The consequence of this is inflation. The prices of goods begin to rise. They rise slowly at first, then more quickly. By 1916 and 1917, prices in most belligerent countries are significantly higher than they were in 1914. Food, clothing, fuel, the basic necessities of working-class life, cost more than they did before the war, and wages, for those not in the munitions industries, have not always kept up. This inflation hits different groups differently. The wealthy, who hold their assets in land and investments, are less affected than those who hold their assets in savings, in bank accounts and savings bonds whose purchasing power is being slowly eroded. The elderly living on fixed incomes, pensions, annuities, government bonds, find that their carefully accumulated security is shrinking. The worker whose wages have risen with the wartime boom finds that his higher pay buys less than he expected. But the most dramatic financial consequence of the war is not what it does to individual households. It is what it does to the structure of global finance. Before the war, London is the financial center of the world. The pound sterling is the global reserve currency, the currency in which international trade is conducted, debts are settled, and savings are held. British banks finance trade from Buenos Aires to Shanghai. British investors own enormous amounts of assets in countries around the world. The City of London in 1914 is arguably the most powerful financial institution in human history. After the war, New York is the financial center of the world. This shift is not an accident. It is a direct consequence of the financial demands of the war. Britain borrows enormous sums from American banks and American investors. America, which remains neutral until 1917, becomes the great supplier of goods and credit to the Allied powers. American exports boom. American industrial capacity expands. American banks grow richer. And when the war ends, Britain is deeply in debt to America, and the balance of financial power has shifted across the Atlantic in a way that it will never entirely shift back. The 20th century, the American century, it begins in the financial counting houses of 1917, in the ledgers that record Britain's borrowing, in the ships full of American goods crossing the Atlantic to feed the Allied war machine. The war doesn't just change fashion and food and the lives of women. It changes the shape of global power, quietly in the back rooms of banks, while the generals are arguing about artillery positions. And as the night deepens, let's move into something a little more personal. Let's talk about what people wore. The corset and the uniform, how 4 years of war remade the human body, and the clothes around it. The corset does not disappear overnight. Nothing in history disappears overnight, but the First World War breaks something in the long relationship between the corset and the respectable woman, and after 1918, the break is real and permanent. Here is how it happens. Women who go to work in the munitions factories cannot wear corsets, not because there is a rule against it, there is no rule against it, but because a corset makes it impossible to do the physical work required. Bending, lifting, reaching, operating machinery, all of these are impeded by a tightly laced corset, and practical women who need to work all day make the practical decision to leave it off. The nurses who work in the field hospitals cannot wear their full civilian dress. They wear uniforms, practical, washable, reasonably comfortable uniforms that allow them to move quickly and bend and lift without hindrance. The wide-brimmed hat with its elaborate decorations has no place in a hospital ward. The ankle-length skirt catches on things and accumulates dirt that is genuinely dangerous in a surgical environment. The starched collar and elaborate sleeves are simply impractical. So the nursing uniform of the First World War is a step toward simplicity. A practical step motivated entirely by practical necessity. A dress of sturdy cotton or linen in a dark color that hides stains. A white apron. A white veil or cap. Sensible, flat-heeled shoes. Nothing unnecessary, nothing that interferes with the work. And the women who wear these uniforms for 4 years, who live in them, who sleep near them, who feel their comparative comfort and practicality every day against the memory of what they wore before, these women go home after the war and cannot entirely go back. The returning munitions worker finds that her pre-war wardrobe feels wrong in ways she struggles to articulate. The returning nurse finds that the elaborate ritual of pre-war dressing feels absurd against the background of what she has seen and done. The woman who has spent 4 years doing a man's job is not easily persuaded that her body needs to be shaped by whalebone into the pre-war S-curve again. This is not yet the flapper of the 1920s. That comes later. But the 1920s flapper, with her short skirt and her flat chest and her bobbed hair and her dancing, that woman is already being created in the factories and field hospitals of 1914 to 1918. She's being created by the practical necessity of a war that required women to move freely and work hard and stop worrying about whether their silhouette was meeting the expectations of fashion plates. But the change in women's clothing during the war is not only about practical necessity, it is also about practicality's companion, shortage. The war creates shortages. Shortages of cloth, shortages of metal, shortages of labor for the garment industries. Governments in all the major belligerent countries issue regulations restricting the use of certain materials, wool, cotton, metal fastenings, for civilian purposes, because these materials are needed for uniforms and equipment. Fashion, for the first time in centuries, must operate under restrictions. Skirts get shorter, not dramatically shorter, but noticeably shorter, rising from ankle length to mid-calf by 1916 or 1917. The reason is purely material. Shorter skirts use less fabric, and fabric is rationed. The elaborate decorations that characterized pre-war fashion, the ribbons and ruffles and excessive embellishments, disappear for the same reason. The hats get simpler and smaller, partly because the hat-making industry has lost many of its workers, and partly because the elaborate pre-war creations require materials that are no longer freely available. And something interesting happens when skirts get shorter. Women start to wear shoes differently. When the hem is at the ankle, the shoe is largely hidden. When the hem rises to mid-calf, the shoe becomes visible, and suddenly the shoe matters in a way it never quite did before. The heeled, decorative, relatively delicate shoe of the pre-war era gives way to something a little more practical, a little more substantial. And the stocking, which now must be seen, since it is no longer hidden under the long hem, becomes an object of attention in its own right. The silk stocking is, before the war, a luxury item for wealthy women. Most working-class and middle-class women wear thick cotton or wool stockings, practical and warm and thoroughly unglamorous. But as the war progresses and wool becomes scarce, thinner stockings become more common, partly from necessity and partly from the influence of the new, shorter hemline. The silk stocking, or increasingly, the cheaper artificial silk stocking, begins its long journey toward becoming a standard item of women's dress. Now let's talk about what the war does to men's clothing, because this is perhaps an even more dramatic story. The 4 years of the First World War put somewhere between 15 and 20 million men in uniform. 15 to 20 million men who, for the duration of the war, wear not their own clothes but the clothes prescribed and provided by their governments. The British Army uniform of the First World War is made of khaki wool. It consists of a tunic, a structured jacket with breast pockets and a standing collar, and matching trousers, a peaked cap, heavy leather boots, a belt. The whole ensemble is designed to be durable, practical, and undistinguishing. Every man in the same uniform is, to a significant degree, the same as every other man in the same uniform. This is the point of the uniform. It equalizes. It erases the visual signals of class and rank that civilian dress so carefully preserves. The working-class soldier and the university-educated officer, trainee, both begin the war wearing the same basic garment. The factory worker and the schoolteacher are indistinguishable before their badges and pips are added. The uniform strips away one of the most fundamental mechanisms of class signaling, the ability to judge a man's social position from his clothes. This is not the intention of the uniform designers. It is a side effect, but it is a real side effect, and it has real consequences. Men who spend 4 years in uniform, sleeping in it, eating in it, working in it, sometimes fighting in it, develop a relationship with clothing that is quite different from the men they were before the war. They have worn uncomfortable, practical, identical clothing for 4 years, and many of them find that when they come home and put on their pre-war civilian suits, something feels different. The stiff collar feels more constricting than it did before, because they have spent 4 years without it. The heavy, formal suit feels unnecessary because they have spent 4 years in a looser tunic. The hat, the bowler hat, the symbol of middle-class male respectability, feels, somehow, slightly comic against the background of what they have been through. The men who come home from the war dress slightly differently from the men who went to it. Not dramatically, not immediately, not all at once, but slightly. The collar gets a little softer, the suit gets a little less formal. The hat gets a little less central to the male costume. And by the 1920s, the change is visible. The decade of the 1920s is famous for its relaxation of formal dress codes, for the rise of the sports jacket, for the growing acceptability of casual clothing in contexts where formal wear was previously required. This relaxation is often attributed to the general social loosening of the 1920s, to the jazz age and the cocktail party and the general desire to forget the war and have fun. And that is part of it. But the deeper cause is the 4 years that millions of men spent in khaki wool, learning that you do not need a stiff collar to be a person. Let's slow down and look at something very small. A button. The buttons of a pre-war suit are, in almost all cases, made of natural materials. Shell buttons made from the nacre of freshwater mussels. Horn buttons made from the horns and hooves of cattle. Bone buttons, fabric-covered buttons. These buttons have been made by hand for centuries, or at most by relatively simple machinery. They are expensive enough that a good suit's buttons are a significant fraction of its total cost. The buttons of a military uniform are different. They must be made in vast quantities, quickly and cheaply, to the exact specifications of the military authorities. They must withstand the conditions of the field: mud, water, chemical exposure, the brutal mechanical demands of men who have no time to be gentle with their equipment. The war creates an enormous demand for cheap, durable buttons. And this demand, one of the smallest and most unglamorous of the war's many demands, helps drive the development of a new material that will change the world: Bakelite. Bakelite is the world's first fully synthetic plastic. It is made from phenol and formaldehyde, mixed and heated and pressed under high pressure into shapes that hold their form permanently. It is hard, durable, heat-resistant, and can be molded into almost any shape. And it can be made in any quantity required, from raw materials that are readily available and cheap. Bakelite was invented in 1907 by Leo Baekeland, a Belgian-American chemist working in New York. Before the war, it is used for a limited range of industrial applications, electrical insulation particularly, because it does not conduct electricity. But the war creates a huge new market for plastic materials, and Bakelite and similar synthetic materials expand rapidly into buttons, handles, instrument cases, equipment components, and 100 other applications. After the war, the plastics industry continues to grow. The 1920s and 1930s see an explosion of new synthetic materials: nylon, polystyrene, polyethylene, perspex, driven partly by the industrial knowledge and manufacturing capacity that the war created. The age of plastics, which defines so much of modern material culture, begins quietly in a laboratory and then in a button factory in the shadow of the First World War. What they ate in the mud, food, rationing, and the long revolution in the kitchen, the war changes what people eat. This is one of its most intimate and lasting effects because food is intimate. It is in the body. It is daily. It is the most fundamental expression of how a society organizes itself and what it values. The change begins with shortage. By 1916, all the major belligerent powers are experiencing significant food shortages. The reasons are multiple and interact with each other in complicated ways. The men who grew the food are in the army. The horses that pulled the plows are in the army. The ships that brought food from abroad are being sunk by submarines. The labor required to process and distribute food is being diverted to war production. And the population, particularly the urban population, is continuing to eat at much the same rate as before the war because human beings need to eat. Germany experiences the food crisis earliest and most severely. The British naval blockade, which prevents food imports from reaching German ports, combined with the enormous demands of the German army, creates genuine shortages in German cities by 1916 and near-famine conditions by the terrible winter of 1916 to 1917, known in German history as the Turnip Winter. The Turnip Winter is exactly what it sounds like. Potatoes, the staple food of the German working class, are in very short supply. Bread is adulterated with increasingly strange substitutes. The calorie ration for German civilians falls far below what is needed for health. And the food that is available is heavily weighted toward turnips and other root vegetables, which are filling but not particularly nutritious, and which, by the winter of 1916, the German population has been eating in such quantities that the mere sight of them provokes something close to despair. The German experience of the turnip winter leaves a mark on the national memory and on national food culture that is difficult to fully measure. A generation of Germans grows up knowing what genuine hunger feels like. They know the specific anxiety of not knowing whether there will be enough to eat tomorrow or next week. They know the desperate creative ingenuity of making something edible from almost nothing. This knowledge shapes how German society thinks about food and economic security for decades afterward. The German political emphasis on agricultural self-sufficiency, the deep-seated anxiety about food imports and foreign dependence, the specific weight that food security carries in German political culture through the 1920s and 1930s, all of this is rooted, at least in part, in the experience of the turnip winter. In Britain, the food crisis is managed differently, though it is real. The British government is initially reluctant to impose rationing. There is a deep ideological resistance to the idea of the government telling people what they can and cannot buy and eat. This smacks of the kind of state interference that British political culture traditionally resists. And there is a practical argument. Britain is an island with a large merchant navy, and food can be imported, even if it is becoming more expensive and more dangerous. By 1917, with German submarines taking a terrible toll on merchant shipping, the food situation is serious enough that the government has to act. Voluntary restrictions are introduced, meatless days, restrictions on bread waste, appeals to patriotic economy. The king himself announces that the royal household is cutting its consumption by a certain percentage per week, in solidarity with the people, but voluntary is not enough. By 1918, formal rationing is introduced for sugar, butter, meat, and some other items. Each household receives a ration book, a small booklet of coupons, each of which must be surrendered when the rationed item is purchased. The quantities allowed are not generous, but they are adequate, and the rationing system has the important property of fairness. Everyone gets the same, regardless of wealth. This fairness is new. Before rationing, the wealthy could simply buy more food at higher prices from the limited supply. The poor went without, as they always had. Rationing, the equal distribution of scarce resources, is a form of enforced solidarity that many people find unexpectedly agreeable. The experience of rationing leaves its mark on British food culture in interesting ways. The recipes that appear in wartime cookbooks, the guides to making the most of limited rations, introduce new foods, new techniques, new ideas about what can be eaten and how. The instruction to eat more vegetables, to waste less meat, to use every part of an animal, these practical wartime lessons are absorbed into the general cooking knowledge of ordinary households, and some of them persist. More broadly, the experience of rationing gives the British government, and later, the British public, a language and a framework for thinking about food as a social and political issue. The question of who gets what and whether the distribution is fair becomes a question that can be asked and argued about in political terms. The National Food Committee, the local food offices, the ration books, these are administrative structures, but they are also habits of thought, ways of understanding food as a collective rather than a purely individual concern. This way of thinking about food as something the government has a legitimate interest in is one of the preconditions for the welfare state that Britain builds after the Second World War. The welfare state's assumption that the government has a responsibility for the basic nutrition and health of its citizens is not invented from scratch after 1945. It grows from seeds planted during the rationing of 1917 and 1918. The war also changes what people eat by introducing them to things they had never eaten before. The British soldier in France encounters French food. Not restaurant French food. He is not, in general, eating in restaurants, but the everyday food of French farms and villages. The rough red wine, the garlic, the coarse mustard, the soft ripened cheeses, the boudin noir, the braised rabbit, the buckwheat crepes of Brittany. Things that would have been completely foreign to the working class man from Birmingham or Glasgow in 1914 are by 1918 recognizable. Not loved, necessarily, and often deeply suspicious, but recognizable. The British soldier returns from France having learned, at minimum, that the world of food is larger than he knew. That people eat things that are not bread and beef and potatoes, and that they eat them because they taste good, not because they are exotic or pretentious. This is a small thing, but it is a real thing, and it contributes over the following decades to the very gradual opening of British food culture to outside influence. The American soldiers who arrive in France in 1917 and 1918, nearly 2 million of them by the end of the war, have a similar experience of cultural collision and expansion, in food and in everything else. The American doughboy who spends time in France eats things he did not know existed. He discovers red wine. He discovers croissants. He discovers the cafe, the outdoor table, the long, slow meal. He discovers that eating is something you can do slowly, for pleasure, rather than efficiently, for fuel. Many of these men go home to America and do not think about these things again, but some of them do. Some of them remember, and some of them tell their wives and their children, and some of them, decades later, open restaurants that serve French food or write cookbooks, or travel back to France as tourists, seeking the memory of something they half experienced when they were young and the world was on fire. The American relationship with French food and French culture, the particular reverence that educated Americans have long felt for the French table, is rooted, at least in part, in the experience of the AEF in France in 1917 and 1918. Julia Child, who almost single-handedly introduced French cooking to middle-class American households in the 1960s, did not serve in the First World War. But she was the product of a cultural moment that the First World War helped create. Let's talk about sugar. Not because sugar is the most important food story of the war, but because sugar is one of the most revealing. Sugar, in 1914, is already a major feature of the British working-class diet. The British consume more sugar per capita than almost any other nation, not because they are particularly indulgent, but because sugar is cheap and sweet and goes well with the tea that is their beverage of choice, and because sweet foods like jam and condensed milk and biscuits have become a major part of the working-class diet over the past half-century. During the war, sugar is rationed, and the sugar ration is not generous. And this enforced reduction in sugar consumption reveals something about its role in the pre-war diet that had not previously been visible. It is, in part, compensating for the inadequacy of everything else. The sugar in the tea and the jam on the bread are providing calories and a feeling of pleasure and fullness that a more varied and nutritious diet would provide by other means. When the sugar is rationed, the inadequacy of the underlying diet becomes more obvious. The medical authorities who study British nutrition during and after the war, and they study it carefully, because the health of the workforce and the military matters to the war effort, learn things about the British diet that are uncomfortable but useful. They learn that the pre-war working-class diet, while providing enough calories, is often deficient in vitamins and certain minerals. They learn that the monotony of the diet, the reliance on bread and potatoes and sweet tea and relatively little fresh fruit and vegetables, is producing a population that is, in various ways, less healthy than it could be. This knowledge contributes to the growing scientific understanding of nutrition, what the body needs, and in what quantities, that will eventually, after the Second World War, produce the food policies and school meal programs and nutritional guidelines that shape what people eat in the second half of the 20th century. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, something equally interesting is happening in the field of medicine. The wounded and the healers, how the war created modern medicine. The First World War is the greatest medical emergency in human history up to that point. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. By the end of the war, roughly 20 million people have been killed, military and civilian combined. Another 20 million or more have been wounded, in ways that range from minor to catastrophic. The medical systems of all the major powers are overwhelmed, repeatedly, throughout the war, and in responding to this overwhelming emergency they invent, almost by necessity, much of modern medicine. Let's start with surgery, because surgery is where the transformation is most dramatic and most lasting. The surgeon of 1914 is a remarkably skilled craftsman, but he is operating with knowledge and techniques that are, in many areas, relatively rudimentary by later standards. He can perform amputations, which is important because the war produces a great many wounds that require them. He can treat simple fractures. He can remove bullets and shrapnel from wounds if they are not too deep. He can perform abdominal surgery, though with a mortality rate that a modern surgeon would find unacceptable. He can operate on the chest with difficulty and risk. What he cannot do very well, what no surgeon can do very well in 1914, is blood transfusion. Blood transfusion is theoretically possible in 1914. The basic science is understood. Blood can be transferred from one person to another, and this can save the life of someone who has lost too much of their own. The ABO blood typing system, which allows doctors to match donor and recipient blood to prevent the immune reaction that causes transfusion to fail, has been worked out by Karl Landsteiner in 1901. A transfusion is still, in 1914, a difficult and unreliable procedure that requires direct connection between donor and recipient, must be performed immediately, and often fails for reasons that are not fully understood. The war changes this. The sheer volume of soldiers who are dying from blood loss, who could be saved if blood were available quickly and reliably, creates an intense pressure to solve the technical problems of transfusion. And the war, with its vast human resources and its desperate need for practical solutions, provides both the material for research and the motivation to conduct it urgently. By 1917, blood transfusion has been transformed. The discovery that sodium citrate can prevent blood from clotting, that blood can be preserved, refrigerated, and transported, allows for the first time the creation of what we would recognize as a blood bank. The stored blood can be transported to the battlefield, mixed with blood from donors, and used hours or days after it was collected. The first blood depot, the first blood bank in modern terms, is established by the British Army near Cambrai in 1917. It is a rudimentary affair, kept in a tent, managed by a small team of dedicated doctors and orderlies. But it works. Soldiers who would previously have bled to death survive because stored blood is available when they need it. The mortality rate from certain categories of wound begins to fall. After the war, the knowledge accumulated in these battlefield blood depots is brought back to civilian medicine, and the blood bank becomes a standard feature of modern hospitals. Today, blood banking is so routine, so thoroughly embedded in the infrastructure of modern medicine, that it is almost invisible. We do not notice it until we need it. But it exists because of what was learned in the tents and dugouts of the Western Front, under conditions of desperate urgency. The management of wound infection is another area where the war drives dramatic progress. Before the war, the greatest cause of surgical death is not the wound itself, but the infection that follows it. The bacteria that live in the soil, particularly in the soil of France and Belgium, which has been farmed for centuries and is rich in organic matter, and thus in microbial life, enter wounds and cause infections that kill more men than the primary injury. Gas gangrene, tetanus, septicemia, these are the invisible killers of the First World War, as lethal in their slow way as the shells and bullets themselves. The surgeons who work in the forward areas of the Western Front develop, over 4 years, an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how to manage infected wounds. They learn that the traditional approach, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed, and hoping for the best, is frequently fatal, because closing a wound that contains bacteria traps the bacteria inside. They learn painfully and through many deaths that the better approach is to debride the wound aggressively, to cut away all the dead and damaged tissue that bacteria thrive in, to leave the wound open, to irrigate it repeatedly, and only to close it when the infection is clearly under control, if at all. This technique, delayed primary closure, is a genuine advance in surgical practice, developed under fire in the operating tents of France. It saves many lives during the war, and it remains standard surgical practice today. Every soldier and civilian who receives a wound that is left open to heal rather than stitched closed immediately is benefiting from knowledge that was bought at great cost on the Western Front. The war also accelerates the development of antiseptic technique, the use of chemical agents to reduce bacterial contamination in wounds and in operating theaters. Various antiseptic solutions are developed and tested under battlefield conditions. The Carroll-Dakin solution, a dilute sodium hypochlorite solution developed by the French surgeon Alexis Carroll and the British chemist Henry Dakin, is one of the most successful, and it is widely used in both military and civilian surgery for decades afterward. Now let's talk about the mind. Because the wound that the First World War inflicts on the human mind is as significant as any physical wound, and the understanding of it, the very slow, reluctant, painful understanding of it, is one of the most important medical legacies of the war. Shell shock. The phrase enters common use in 1915, coined by the British military Dr. Charles Myers to describe a condition he is seeing in soldiers who have been near large artillery explosions. These soldiers, men who have not been physically wounded, who show no external injury, are exhibiting a bewildering range of symptoms. Some of them cannot speak, some of them cannot walk or walk with strange, jerking, uncontrolled movements. Some of them have lost the ability to see or hear without any apparent physical cause. Some of them tremble uncontrollably. Some of them are paralyzed on one side of their body. Some of them have nightmares so violent and so real that they cannot tell the waking world from the world of the dream. The initial explanation that these symptoms are the result of physical damage caused by the pressure waves of nearby explosions, literally shaking the brain inside the skull, is quickly found to be inadequate. Many shell shock cases occur in soldiers who have never been near an explosion. The symptoms do not match the patterns of physical brain injury. something else is happening. What is happening, as the military doctors gradually and reluctantly come to understand, is psychological injury. These men have been traumatized, not physically but mentally, by the cumulative experience of the trenches, the constant threat of death, the witnessing of horrifying things, the impossibility of escape, the loss of control, the sheer sustained horror of trench life over weeks and months and years. The concept of psychological injury is not entirely new in 1914. Sigmund Freud and his colleagues have been developing the theory of psychological trauma for decades, and there is a pre-war literature on what is called neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, that describes some of the symptoms of what we now call PTSD. But the scale of psychological injury in the First World War is something that the existing framework of understanding cannot easily accommodate. The military response to shell shock is, initially, deeply inadequate and sometimes actively harmful. Many military authorities, generals, politicians, medical officers who should know better, regard shell shock as a form of cowardice. Men who exhibit its symptoms are sometimes accused of malingering, of pretending to be ill in order to escape their duties. Some are court-martialed, a very small number are executed, but the sheer scale of the problem makes denial impossible. By 1916, shell shock accounts for a significant proportion of the British Army's casualties. There are not enough men to fight the war and also to ignore the psychological wounds. Something has to be done. What is done, the treatment of shell shock in the British Army, is a messy, contested, improvised, but ultimately historically significant story. The doctors who are brought in to treat shell shock cases, men like W.H.R. Rivers, who works at Craiglockhart War Hospital near Edinburgh, where the war poets Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen are among his patients, develop treatment methods that are genuinely innovative and that will influence psychiatry and psychology for decades. Rivers's approach is conversational. He talks to his patients. He encourages them to talk about their experiences, not to suppress the memories of horror, as military culture dictates, but to face them, examine them, integrate them into a narrative that the mind can tolerate. He observes that his patients improve when they are able to express what has happened to them, and he develops a therapeutic method that is recognizably psychoanalytic in its structure, though he is not a strict Freudian. The treatment of shell shock at Craiglockhart and other facilities is not uniformly successful, and the understanding of psychological injury is still very limited. But the war forces a confrontation with the reality of psychological damage that medicine cannot afterwards entirely ignore. The shell shock cases of 1914 to 1918 are the direct ancestors of the PTSD cases of every subsequent conflict. The condition is recognized, named, partially understood, because of what happened in the trenches. After the war, psychiatry and psychology expand rapidly. The shell shock experience demonstrates that the mind can be injured, that psychological injury is real and serious and treatable, at least partially, and that the treatment requires talking and understanding rather than dismissal and punishment. These ideas feed into the broader expansion of psychological services, the growth of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, the eventual recognition of mental health as a legitimate medical concern. The veterans' hospitals of the post-war years, the institutions where the shell-shocked and the physically wounded of the First World War live out their broken lives, are not pleasant places, but they are places where medical knowledge accumulates, slowly and painfully, and some of that knowledge is still with us. There is one more medical consequence of the First World War that deserves considerable attention, and it is one that is often overlooked in the standard histories because it does not fit neatly into the story of the war itself. It is the influenza pandemic of 1918. The influenza pandemic of 1918, sometimes called the Spanish flu, which is a misnomer, as it did not originate in Spain, is the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. It infects somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people worldwide, roughly a quarter to a third of the entire human population at the time, and kills between 50 and 100 million of them. To put that in perspective, the pandemic kills more people in 1 year than the entire First World War killed in 4. It kills more people than any war in history up to that point, and possibly more than any subsequent conflict as well. The pandemic is not caused by the war, in the sense that the influenza virus exists and mutates independently of human military activities, but the war creates the conditions in which the virus spreads with extraordinary speed and lethality. The trenches are perfect incubators for respiratory disease, millions of men living in close quarters, weakened by poor nutrition and physical stress, moving in huge numbers by train and ship across countries and continents. Military supply lines that feed men and equipment to the front also, without anyone planning it, create a global network for the transmission of disease. The pandemic demonstrates with terrible clarity the connection between human mobility and epidemic disease, a connection that has always existed, but that the modern world has made both more dangerous and more visible. The ships that carry soldiers from America to France carry the virus. The trains that move the troops carry the virus. The refugee movements that the war creates, millions of people displaced from their homes, moving through crowded camps and depots and railway stations, carry the virus. After the pandemic, public health becomes a matter of international concern in a way that it had not quite been before. The League of Nations, the international organization created after the war to prevent future wars, includes a health organization, the direct predecessor of the World Health Organization. The idea that disease is not merely a local or national problem, but a global one, that it requires international cooperation and international institutions to manage, is one of the ideas that the pandemic plants firmly in the international political consciousness. This idea, that global problems require global institutions, is one of the most important ideas of the 20th century. It drives the creation of the United Nations, the WHO, the international financial institutions. The First World War and its pandemic are the first clear demonstration, at the modern scale, that some problems are too large for individual nations to manage alone. And as the night deepens further, let's step away from the battlefield entirely and look at something that is happening in the background of all of this. Something that is not about weapons or wounds or governments. Something that is happening in laboratories, chemistry and the changed earth, how the war built the modern chemical industry. The First World War is, among other things, a chemist's war. This phrase is used by historians to distinguish the First World War from earlier conflicts, in which the primary weapons were mechanical, swords, cannons, rifles, rather than chemical. The Great War introduces, on a large scale, several things that require chemistry: poison gas, explosives made from synthetic compounds, the mass production of artificial materials. But the chemical transformation that the war drives is not only about weapons, it is also about agriculture, and this is perhaps the more lasting and the more consequential story. Let's start at the beginning, which is a question that sounds simple but has a complicated answer. Where does the nitrogen in your food come from? Nitrogen is essential to life. All proteins contain nitrogen. All the amino acids that your body uses to build itself, every enzyme, every antibody, every structural molecule in every cell contains nitrogen atoms. Without nitrogen, there is no protein, and without protein, there is no life. Plants get the nitrogen they need from the soil. They absorb it through their roots in the form of nitrates and ammonium compounds dissolved in soil water. And the nitrogen in the soil ultimately comes from bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, that live in the soil and in the roots of certain plants, particularly legumes, and that have the remarkable ability to take nitrogen from the air and convert it into the chemical forms that plants can use. For most of human history, this bacterial nitrogen fixation, supplemented by the use of manure and other organic fertilizers, has been sufficient to support agricultural production. But by the end of the 19th century, with the human population growing rapidly and the demand for food increasing correspondingly, it is becoming clear that this natural nitrogen supply is not adequate. The major supplement is guano, the accumulated droppings of seabirds and bats, rich in nitrogen, mined from islands off the coast of South America and imported in great quantities to Europe and North America as fertilizer. The guano deposits are finite, and by the late 19th century, they are becoming depleted. There is also Chilean saltpeter, sodium nitrate, mined in the Atacama Desert and used both as fertilizer and as a raw material for explosives. Chile essentially has a monopoly on this resource, and Europe and North America are dependent on Chilean saltpeter both for growing their food and for making their gunpowder. This dual dependence on saltpeter for both agriculture and armaments is one of the reasons why the German chemist Fritz Haber, working in the early years of the 20th century, is trying to find a way to synthesize ammonia, the simplest nitrogen compound, directly from the hydrogen and nitrogen in the air. Haber succeeds in 1909. Working with the industrial chemist Carl Bosch, who scales up the laboratory process to industrial production, he develops the Haber-Bosch process, a method for combining nitrogen from the air with hydrogen under high pressure and temperature, using iron as a catalyst to produce ammonia. The Haber-Bosch process is one of the most significant technological achievements in human history. It is not an exaggeration to say that without it, the world could not support its current population. The synthetic nitrogen fertilizers produced by the Haber-Bosch process and its successors and derivatives are responsible for roughly half of all the nitrogen in the food eaten by the human beings alive today. Half of the nitrogen in your body almost certainly passed through a Haber-Bosch plant at some point. Half of the nitrogen in the food of 8 billion people comes, ultimately, from a process invented by a German chemist in the early 20th century. The Haber-Bosch process begins its industrial career before the First World War, but it is the war that drives its expansion to the scale that changes the world. When the war begins, Germany is in a difficult position with respect to nitrates. The British naval blockade cuts off Germany's access to Chilean saltpeter, access that Germany needs both for its explosives industry and for its agriculture. Without nitrates, Germany cannot make enough explosives to fight the war and cannot make enough fertilizer to grow enough food to feed its population. The Haber-Bosch process solves the explosives problem. Synthetic ammonia can be converted to nitric acid, which can be used to make the explosive compounds that the German war machine requires. The German government invests heavily in expanding Haber-Bosch production during the war, building large industrial facilities that run at full capacity throughout the conflict. After the war, this enormous industrial capacity does not disappear. The Haber-Bosch plants that were built to make nitrogen for explosives are converted, most of them, to making nitrogen for fertilizers. The industrial infrastructure of the wartime chemical industry becomes the infrastructure of the post-war agricultural revolution. And the post-war agricultural revolution is real and significant. Cheap synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, available in quantities that would have been impossible before the war, allow farmers to grow more food per acre than ever before. Crop yields rise. The fear of Malthusian collapse, the fear that the human population would inevitably grow faster than its food supply, leading to famine and catastrophe, begins slowly to recede. This is, paradoxically, one of the most positive legacies of the First World War. The war drives the expansion of a technology, synthetic nitrogen fixation, that has probably done more to sustain human life than any other single technological development of the 20th century. Fritz Haber, the chemist who made it possible, is one of the most complicated figures of his era, the man who invented the process that feeds the world, who also developed the poison gas weapons that the German army used at Ypres in 1915, killing thousands. The same chemistry, serving life and death simultaneously. Let's talk about what happens to chemistry more broadly. The war creates an urgent demand for chemical products of all kinds: explosives, propellants, chlorine gas and phosgene and mustard gas, antiseptics, medications, dyes, fuels. And the war creates, through the disruption of international trade and the cutting off of the imports on which national chemical industries have previously depended, both the necessity and the opportunity for each belligerent nation to develop its own chemical industry. Britain in 1914 is heavily dependent on Germany for many of the chemicals it uses. This is partly a consequence of Germany's extraordinary dominance of the international chemical industry before the war, a dominance so complete that Britain imports most of its synthetic dyes, many of its pharmaceuticals, and significant quantities of industrial chemicals from Germany. When the war cuts off these imports, Britain faces a chemical crisis. The textile industry, which uses synthetic dyes to color its fabrics, suddenly cannot get the dyes it needs. The pharmaceutical industry cannot get the drug intermediates it needs. The explosives industry needs chemicals it cannot produce in sufficient quantities. The British government's response is to invest heavily and quickly in building a British chemical industry. Factories are built, chemists are trained and employed. The academic chemical tradition that Germany has developed over half a century in its great research universities is replicated, imperfectly and hastily, in Britain. After the war, this British chemical industry, built under the pressure of wartime necessity, does not vanish. It persists and grows, and becomes the foundation of one of the most successful post-war British industries. Imperial Chemical Industries, ICI, is formed in 1926 partly from the firms that were created or expanded during the war. It goes on to become one of the largest chemical companies in the world, and to develop products, including nylon, polyester, and various pharmaceuticals, that are part of modern life. The American chemical industry undergoes a similar transformation, driven by the same wartime pressures. America also was dependent on German chemical imports before the war, and the war, first through the disruption of trade, and then through direct American participation, creates the same urgent need to develop domestic production. The post-war American chemical industry is orders of magnitude larger than the pre-war one. DuPont, Dow Chemical, Union Carbide, the companies that will define 20th century American industry, and that will produce the synthetic materials of the modern world, all grow dramatically during and after the First World War. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, something is happening in the sky. The aviators, how the war made the air age. The First World War begins with fewer than 500 military aircraft among all the major powers. This is worth pausing on because it is so difficult to believe from the perspective of the modern world, in which air power is the central element of any major military force. In August 1914, the airplane is 12 years old. The Wright brothers made their first powered flight in 1903, and in the 11 years since then, the airplane has been developed from a fragile experimental machine that can barely sustain flight for a few minutes into a somewhat less fragile experimental machine that can fly for several hours and carry a passenger, though it is still not reliably capable of either. The military of 1914, on the whole, does not quite know what to do with airplanes. They are used initially for reconnaissance, for the relatively undemanding task of flying over the enemy's positions and observing what is there, which is something that was previously done by observers in balloons, and before that by men with telescopes on hilltops. The airplane is faster than the balloon and can fly over areas that the balloon cannot reach, so it is useful for this purpose, but it is fragile. The aircraft of 1914 are constructed of wood and canvas and wire, and they are not much more robust than a very large kite. They cannot fly in heavy rain or strong winds. Their engines, rotary engines of limited power, are temperamental and frequently break down. Their instruments are rudimentary. Their fuel capacity is limited. They require flat, smooth fields to take off and land, and the Western Front has very few flat, smooth fields that are not under artillery fire. And yet, within 4 years, the aircraft of 1918 are something altogether different. They are made of stronger materials. Duralumin, a light aluminum alloy, has replaced wood in many structural components. Their engines produce 10 times or more the power of 1914 engines, allowing them to fly faster and higher and longer. They carry machine guns synchronized with the propeller, an innovation developed by the Dutch designer Anthony Fokker in 1915, and they fight each other in the air in the aerial combat that becomes one of the romantic myths of the war. The dogfight, the duel above the clouds, the brief, brilliant lives of the aces who are the celebrities of their time. The war drives aviation technology forward at a pace that would have been inconceivable in peacetime. The pressure of military necessity, the urgent need for airplanes that fly faster, higher, longer, and with greater reliability, concentrates the resources of the major powers on the problem of flight in a way that no peacetime market could have done. Money flows freely. The best engineers and designers are exempted from military service to work on aircraft development. Tests that would normally take years are conducted in weeks. Failures that would normally be cautious and incremental are accepted and moved past. The result is that the aircraft of 1918 is, technologically, several generations ahead of the aircraft of 1914, and the knowledge accumulated during 4 years of urgent aviation development does not evaporate when the war ends. The engineers and pilots and mechanics who have spent 4 years making aircraft go faster and higher and longer come home in 1918 with knowledge and skills that have no peacetime application except aviation. The aircraft factories that have been producing hundreds of airplanes per month cannot simply close, because there is a workforce and a management structure and a knowledge base that has been built up at enormous expense. Something must be done with them. What is done with them is commercial aviation. The first commercial airline services begin in 1919. The routes are short. The aircraft are converted military bombers, adapted to carry a few passengers in conditions that are, by the most generous assessment, Spartan. The first regular service between London and Paris, operated by Aircraft Transport and Travel in 1919, carries 1 or 2 passengers in an open cockpit, flying low over the English Channel at speeds that make the crossing in a few hours rather than the overnight ferry journey it has previously required. The passengers are wealthy, adventurous, or both. They are not comfortable exactly. The aircraft are noisy and cold and turbulent, but they are fast, and fast is the future, and enough of them find the experience interesting enough to try again. The airlines grow slowly through the 1920s. They are not yet reliable enough or cheap enough to threaten the railways for ordinary travel. But the technology continues to develop. The aircraft get larger and more comfortable. The routes extend. And by the 1930s, there are airlines crossing the Atlantic, crossing the Pacific, connecting cities that had previously been days of travel apart. The air age that defines the second half of the 20th century, the age of mass air travel, of the world made smaller by flight, of the jet engine and the 747, and the package holiday and the shrinking of distance, begins in the aircraft factories of 1914 to 1918, in the urgent, expensive, dangerous laboratories of the First Air War. Let's talk about one more aspect of the aviation story, because it connects to something that will matter greatly in the decades after the war. The war produces not only aircraft, but airmen, hundreds of thousands of men who have learned, under pressure and at great risk, to fly. They have learned to navigate by landmarks and by instruments in limited visibility. They have learned to manage engines under stress. They have learned to think in 3 dimensions, to judge distances and speeds and altitudes in ways that ground-bound humanity has never needed to. When the war ends, these men are demobilized. They have no job, except that they know how to fly, and the flying skills they have are usable in peacetime only for civil aviation. which is at that point a very small and uncertain industry. Many of them find work as barnstormers, performers who travel from town to town with a small aircraft, giving demonstrations and offering rides for a fee at fairgrounds and open fields. The barnstormer is a figure of the 1920s in America particularly, touring the small towns of the Midwest and the South, astounding local populations who have never seen a flying machine up close, doing stunts above the town square on a Saturday afternoon while the townsfolk look up from below. The barnstormer does not just entertain, he also demonstrates. He shows people who have never thought about aviation that it is real, that it works, that a machine made of metal and canvas and engine can actually leave the ground and return to it without killing everyone aboard. The barnstormer normalizes flight, makes it part of the mental furniture of a generation that will eventually, when aircraft become safe and cheap enough, choose to travel by air rather than by any other means. The war creates the pilots create the barnstormers create the public appetite for aviation. The public appetite creates the airlines create the modern world in which distance is measured in hours rather than miles. All of this begins in August 1914, when the first reconnaissance pilot climbs into his canvas and wood machine and coaxes it into the French morning sky. The sounds of a changed world, music, art, and the culture of after the war changes what people hear. Not only in the obvious sense, the sound of artillery, the silence after, but in the sense of the music that fills the post-war years, the art that people make to understand what happened and what it has left them with, the stories that are told and how they are told. Let's start with jazz. Jazz is not invented by the First World War. Its roots are in the African-American musical traditions of the American South, in blues and ragtime and gospel, and the particular musical genius of communities that have maintained their culture through generations of oppression. By 1914, jazz is already a living musical form, played in the dance halls and clubs and streets of New Orleans, and beginning to spread northward along the Mississippi to Chicago and beyond. But it is the First World War that carries jazz to Europe, and it is the encounter between jazz and post-war Europe that makes jazz into the first global popular music. The mechanism is straightforward. When the United States enters the war in 1917, the military deploys African-American regiments, legally segregated from white regiments, as the American military is segregated throughout this period, and among these regiments are musicians. In particular, there is the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, who bring with them a military band conducted by the brilliant musician James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe's band tour France during and after the war, performing concerts at military camps and in French cities. And the French, who have their own rich musical tradition but who have not previously encountered anything quite like this, are transfixed, the syncopated rhythms. The improvisation, the blue notes and bent pitches that give jazz its characteristic emotional texture, the way the musicians interact with each other and with the audience, the sense of spontaneous creation happening in real time, all of this is new and electrifying to European ears accustomed to classical forms and their elaborate rules. French musicians are particularly captivated. The composers Darius Milhaud and Francis Poulenc, both of whom encounter American jazz during or just after the war, incorporate jazz elements into their work in ways that permanently change the sound of French concert music. The great French conductor Ernest Ansermet, after attending a concert by the Southern Syncopated Orchestra in London in 1919, writes a famous essay describing jazz as the beginning of a new musical culture, the first European critical recognition of jazz as a serious artistic form rather than a curiosity. Through the 1920s, jazz spreads across Europe. The decade of the 1920s in Europe is, in musical terms, the jazz age as much as it is in America. The dance halls of Paris and London and Berlin fill with the sound of jazz bands. The foxtrot and the charleston replace the waltz on the dance floors of the fashionable world. And the music that fills the cabarets and cafes of Weimar Berlin, the music that is the soundtrack of one of the most creative and tragic decades in European cultural history, is soaked in jazz, refracted through German and French and Eastern European musical sensibilities into something entirely new. The global dominance of American popular music in the 20th century, the fact that the music of the world, for the past 100 years, has been shaped primarily by American forms and American artists, begins with this encounter between the American military band and the European audience, in the strange interlude between the end of fighting and the beginning of whatever came next. Let's talk about what the war does to the visual arts. The visual arts in 1914 are already in a state of turbulence. The late 19th and early 20th centuries have seen an extraordinary explosion of new movements: Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, Expressionism, each of which represents a departure from the academic tradition of representational painting that had dominated Western art for centuries. The artists of the pre-war era, Picasso, Matisse, Kirchner, Kandinsky, are already pushing hard against the walls of conventional representation, finding new ways to express inner states and formal experiments that have little to do with making things look like they look. The war accelerates this process in ways that are not always immediately obvious. Many of the artists who serve in the war, and many of them do serve, because most able-bodied men of their generation serve, come back with experiences that cannot be represented by any of the existing artistic languages. The landscapes they have lived in for 4 years, the devastated, upturned, shell-cratered moonscapes of the Western Front, are literally unlike anything the visual tradition has attempted to represent. And the internal landscapes of men who have survived things that the mind cannot fully process are equally beyond the reach of conventional representation. The post-war years are a period of intense artistic experimentation, partly in response to this expressive emergency. Dadaism, the most radical artistic movement of the post-war years, is born directly out of the sense that the old cultural forms have failed, that the civilization which produced the war has forfeited its claim to the authority of tradition. The Dadaists do not want to make beautiful things. They want to make things that are deliberately anti-beautiful, that challenge the assumption that art serves the purposes of the civilization that makes it. Surrealism, which grows from Dadaism, carries into visual art the same interest in the unconscious, the irrational, the dream world that the war has revealed to be as real and as powerful as the waking world. The surrealist painting, with its juxtaposition of familiar objects in impossible contexts, its dreamlike precision in rendering things that cannot exist, is, among other things, a representation of the mental experience of a generation that has lived through something that cannot be fully rendered in rational terms. The abstract expressionism of the mid-20th century, the painting that abandons representation entirely, that treats the canvas as a field for the direct expression of emotional and psychological states, traces a direct line back through Dadaism and Surrealism to the expressive emergency created by the First World War. But the war also produces more explicitly documentary art. The British and Canadian governments commission war artists, painters who go to the front to record what they see. Paul Nash, who serves as both a soldier and an official war artist, produces paintings of the devastated landscape of the Western Front that are among the most powerful images of the 20th century. His We Are Making a New World, a painting of a blasted landscape of black tree stumps and shell craters under a rising sun, is not realistic in the photographic sense, but it is profoundly true in a deeper sense. It captures not just what the landscape looks like, but what it means, what it feels like to be in it, what it says about human civilization and its capacity for self-destruction. The photography of the First World War is also significant, though it is a subject that requires careful handling. The photographs that survive from the Western Front, the images of soldiers in trenches, of devastated landscapes, of columns of prisoners and columns of refugees, are the first mass visual documentation of a major war. They are seen by millions of people through illustrated newspapers and magazines during the war itself, and they shape the public's understanding of what is happening in a way that no previous war's images could. Photography is, in 1914, a relatively mature medium. It has existed for 75 years, and its basic technical challenges are largely solved. But its use as journalism, as a medium for documenting current events and showing them to a mass audience, is still new. The illustrated press of the First World War, publications like the Illustrated London News and similar publications in France and Germany, give millions of people their first visual connection to a war being fought in their name, and this visual connection, this seeing, changes the relationship between the public and the war in ways that will matter enormously in subsequent conflicts. Let's talk about literature. Because the literature produced by the First World War, and more broadly, the change that the war makes in how writers write and what writing is for, is one of the most significant cultural legacies of the whole conflict. The literature of the pre-war era is not, on the whole, a literature of irony. The great novelists and poets and playwrights of the Edwardian period write in a mode that takes for granted the seriousness and the value of the things they are writing about. The civilization they inhabit is worth taking seriously. The institutions, the family, the church, the nation, the empire, deserve the weight that literary attention gives them. Language is adequate to experience, or can be made adequate by sufficient care and art. The war breaks this assumption. The poets who go to the war, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Edward Thomas, Isaac Rosenberg, Rupert Brooke, find themselves in a situation where the language available to them is catastrophically inadequate to the things they are trying to describe. The poetic conventions of 1914, the elevated diction, the romantic imagery, the comfortable connection between the natural world and human feeling, seem not just insufficient but actively dishonest when brought to bear on the experience of the trench. Wilfred Owen, who is killed 1 week before the armistice, writes poems that are formally innovative partly out of necessity. The old forms cannot carry the weight of what he is trying to say. His use of pararhyme, imperfect rhymes that almost rhyme but don't quite, creates a quality of unease that exactly matches the unease of what he is describing. His diction is deliberately anti-elevated, deliberately close to spoken language, because the grandiose literary language of the pre-war period feels, in the context of the trenches, like a lie. The old lie, Owen calls it in his most famous poem, Dulce et decorum est / pro patria mori, the Latin tag from Horace that means, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, and that has been used to inspire soldiers and comfort their families for centuries. Owen calls it a lie directly, because he has seen what the dying actually looks like, and it looks nothing like sweetness or fitness or anything that the old literary language is equipped to describe. This willingness to call the traditional language a lie, to use the poem as a weapon against the official culture rather than a celebration of it, is one of the most important moments in the history of English literature. It licenses subsequent writers to be ironic, to be skeptical, to distrust official language and official narratives, to treat the literary tradition as something that can be quarreled with rather than something that must be respected. The great novels of the post-war years, Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, Remarks All Quiet on the Western Front, Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That, are all in different ways continuations of this argument against the official language of war and patriotism. They insist on the reality of the body, the particular and unglamorous details of what it actually feels like to be in a war, the gap between what the generals say and what the soldiers experience. They create a new literary mode that is direct and unsentimental and distrustful of abstraction, and this mode becomes one of the dominant modes of 20th century literature. Hemingway's famous style, short sentences, precise nouns, the avoidance of adjectives that might claim more emotional weight than the facts can support, is, at its deepest level, a response to the dishonesty of the language that was used to send a generation into the trenches. And as we move deeper into this story, let's return to something we have only touched on briefly. Let's return to the people who were not the soldiers. Empire, race, and the seeds of a different world, what the war did for, and to the people the history books forget the First World War is fought, in large part, by the empires. Britain, France, and Germany are all imperial powers, and all of them draw on the human and material resources of their empires to fight the war. The Indian Army, which provides over 1 million soldiers to the British war effort. The West African Toreadors, who fight in France and in Africa. The Senegalese infantry, whose contribution to the French war effort is enormous and who are frequently deployed in the most dangerous positions. The Gurkhas from Nepal. The Australians and New Zealanders and Canadians, and South Africans and soldiers from the Caribbean and East Africa and West Africa and the Pacific Islands. All of these men fight under the flags of empires that do not consider them equal to the soldiers of the metropolitan countries. They fight for wages that are often lower. They serve in units that are often commanded by officers of a different race. They are sometimes deployed as shock troops put in the front lines of the most dangerous attacks in ways that their metropolitan counterparts are not. And when the war is over, they are sent home, with their medals if they have been given medals, with their pensions if they have been awarded pensions, with their memories which they carry alone, because the shared experience of the war is not something their home communities can fully understand or enter into. But they also go home with something else. They go home having seen the metropolitan world, having served alongside men from different countries and different cultures. Having discovered, in many cases, that the Europeans who rule them are not, in the trench or the casualty clearing station or the prisoner of war camp, as different from themselves as the imperial ideology insists. The Indian soldier who fights in France in 1914 and 1915, some of them serve in the earliest battles, before the Indian Corps is eventually moved to other theaters, sees European men die in the same mud that European men have said is the natural habitat of civilization. He sees European soldiers who are frightened and hungry and homesick and sometimes cowardly and sometimes brave and above all mortal. He sees that the racial hierarchy of empire is not a reflection of natural difference but a political construction, a construction that can be, and perhaps should be, questioned. The men who come home from the war carrying these observations are not all radical thinkers or political activists. Most of them are farmers and artisans and shopkeepers who go back to their ordinary lives and do not publicly challenge the imperial order, but they tell their sons who tell their sons. And the generation that leads the independence movements of the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s is the generation that grows up hearing stories from fathers and grandfathers who fought in the war and came home knowing something that the empire did not intend for them to know. The experience of the First World War is not the only cause of decolonization. Decolonization is a complex, long process with many causes. But the First World War is one of the important causes, one of the experiences that demonstrates to the people living under empire that empire is neither natural nor inevitable. The political language of the war also matters. Woodrow Wilson, the American president who leads the United States into the war in 1917, articulates an idealistic vision of what the war should accomplish. It should be, he says, a war to make the world safe for democracy. The peace settlement should be based on the principle of national self-determination, the principle that peoples have the right to govern themselves, to determine their own political destiny. This principle, national self-determination, is applied after the war in Europe. The old multinational empires of Central Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, are dismantled, and new nations are carved from their territories. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and others. The principle is imperfectly applied. The new nations are not ethnically homogeneous. The national groups are too intermingled for clean separation to be possible, but the attempt is made. What Wilson does not intend, and what the European imperial powers emphatically do not intend, is that self-determination should be applied outside Europe. The peace settlements of 1919 give the former German colonies not to independence but to the other empires, as League of Nations mandates, territories administered by Britain or France in the name of eventually, someday, preparing them for self-governance. But the people of these territories have heard Wilson's speeches. They have read the principle of self-determination, and they note with interest and with increasing bitterness that the principle seems to apply to Poles and Czechs but not to Egyptians and Vietnamese and West Africans. They note this and they remember it, and 30 years later they invoke it, loudly and effectively, in the movements that will end the imperial age. Ho Chi Minh, who will lead the Vietnamese struggle for independence, first against France and then against the United States, is living in Paris in 1919, working as a kitchen helper and a photo retoucher when the peace conference takes place at Versailles. He writes a petition on behalf of the people of Vietnam, appealing to the principles of self-determination that Wilson has articulated. He takes it to the peace conference. He is not received. But he writes it, and he remembers writing it, and he keeps his copy of it for the rest of his life. The war also changes the situation of women in the colonial world, though this is a story that is less often told. In India, the war mobilizes an enormous range of support activities: fundraising, the organization of supplies, the management of hospitals, the support of soldiers' families, that brings women from the educated Indian middle classes into public life in ways that would not have been possible before. The war effort requires organization, and the organization of the women's side of the war effort creates experience and networks and habits of public activity that feed into the Indian women's movement of the 1920s and 1930s. In West Africa, the absence of male labor creates similar pressures and similar opportunities as in Europe. Women take on roles in agriculture, trade, and community organization that expand their public roles and their economic power. The war does not simply liberate women in the colonial world. The story is far more complicated than that, and the existing structures of patriarchy and colonial rule are not undone by 4 years of war. But the war disturbs things. It shifts things slightly. It creates openings and experiences and knowledge that feed into the longer, slower processes of change that unfold over the following decades. The architecture of a changed world, how the war reshaped the cities we live in. The First World War reshapes the physical world. Not only in the obvious sense, the devastated landscapes of the Western Front, the ruined cities, the cemeteries that dot the French and Belgian countryside in rows so regular and so vast that they are visible from the air, but also in the sense of how cities are designed, how people live, how houses are built and furnished and arranged. Let's start with the most basic thing, the house itself. Before the war in Britain and in many other European countries, the dominant form of working-class housing is the terraced row house. These are houses built in long rows, sharing party walls, without front gardens or back gardens or very much space at all. They are built to be cheap and to house the maximum number of people in the minimum amount of land near the factory, or the mine, or the dock where their occupants work. These houses have no indoor bathrooms in most cases. They have privies in the backyard, small separate structures, shared by several families not connected to the water supply. They have no running hot water. They have coal fires in the ground floor rooms, and the bedrooms above are heated when they are heated at all by the warmth rising from below. They are damp in many cases because they are built on clay soil with inadequate foundations, and the damp rises through the walls and floors. This is how a significant portion of the British working class lives in 1914, and the people who live in these houses do not, on the whole, expect anything different. This is what working class housing has been for several generations, and there is no obvious reason to expect it to change. The war changes it. indirectly, slowly, through a chain of causes that takes years to fully work through, but it changes it. The mechanism is this: the war creates, in Britain and in most other belligerent countries, the beginnings of the welfare state. Not instantly, not all at once, not even primarily as an act of idealism, but because the war makes it politically impossible to continue running society the way it was run before. The working class men who are asked to fight and die for their country are the same men who live in the damp terraced rows with no bathrooms. The men who come home from the war, or the families of those who don't come home, are not willing to go back to the pre-war arrangement without some acknowledgement that the arrangement was inadequate. The phrase that is used again and again in British politics after the war is "a land fit for heroes," the promise, made during the war and attributed to Lloyd George, that the men who fight will come home to a country that has improved itself in their absence. The promise is not fully kept. The interwar years are deeply difficult economically, particularly after the Wall Street crash of 1929, and the housing programs and social improvements that were promised are often delayed or reduced. But the principle that the government has a responsibility for the living conditions of its working-class citizens, is established, and it is not entirely abandoned. In Britain, the interwar years see the construction of enormous new council housing, estates, public housing built and managed by local authorities, and rented to working-class families at below-market rates. These estates are not, by modern standards, particularly spacious or comfortable, but they represent an enormous improvement over the pre-war terraced rows. They have indoor toilets, they have bathrooms, they have small gardens. They are built to standards, minimum room sizes, light requirements, ventilation, that did not exist before the war. The Garden City movement, the pre-war idea, developed by the social reformer Ebenezer Howard, that the ideal community is neither the congested city nor the isolated countryside, but a planned combination of both, finds its first major practical expression in the interwar years, partly because the war has created the political will for large-scale housing reform. Well, in Garden City, Letchworth, and many of the planned new suburbs that grow around British and European cities between the wars reflect the Garden City ideal, filtered through the practical realities of interwar politics and economics. The American experience is different but runs in a similar direction. The war creates in America, as in Britain, a brief window of political willingness to address social problems that had previously been treated as natural and unchangeable. The progressive movement, which predates the war but which gains momentum from the war's demonstration of what organized national effort can accomplish, pushes for improvements in housing, public health, labor conditions, and other areas of social welfare. The American city that emerges from the interwar years is shaped partly by the war's legacy, by the new immigrants who arrive in the 1910s and 1920s, by the great migration of African Americans from the South to the northern cities that the war's labor demands accelerate, by the progressive planning ideas that the war makes politically possible. Let's talk about the automobile, because the automobile is one of the things that the war makes possible, or rather, one of the things that the war makes universal. Before the war, as we noted, the automobile is a rich person's toy. In 1914, most people have never ridden in one. The roads are not designed for them. The fuel is not always available. The mechanical knowledge required to operate and maintain one is specialized and unusual. The war changes this. The war requires motor vehicles, trucks to carry supplies, ambulances to carry the wounded, staff cars to carry officers, motorcycles to carry dispatch riders. The major belligerent powers buy motor vehicles in enormous quantities, manufacture them in enormous quantities, and train enormous numbers of men to drive them. The men who are trained to drive trucks and ambulances and motorcycles during the war are, after the war, men who know how to drive. This seems like a small thing, but it is not. In 1914, the ability to drive a motor vehicle is a specialized skill possessed by relatively few people. By 1918, it is a skill possessed by millions of men who have learned it as part of their military service. These men come home knowing how to drive, and some of them want to own a car. The automobile industry, particularly in America, where Henry Ford's production innovations have already made the Model T affordable by working-class standards, is positioned to supply this demand. The 1920s are the decade in which the automobile transitions from luxury to middle-class aspiration to, in America at least, near necessity. The road network is extended and improved. The gasoline station appears on every main road. The culture of the automobile, the road trip, the drive in the suburb, the car culture begins to take shape. And the suburb is inseparable from the automobile, which is inseparable from the war. The suburb as a form of settlement, the residential community outside the city center, accessible by car but not on foot or by public transit, requires the automobile to exist. And the automobile becomes available to ordinary people in large numbers because the war trained hundreds of thousands of men to drive, and because the automobile industry, having geared up to supply the war, had the productive capacity to meet the post-war demand. The suburban world that most people in wealthy countries inhabit today, the world of single-family houses with garages, of car-dependent living, of commutes on motorways and highways, has many causes. But the First World War is one of them, working through the chain of automobile adoption and road building that follows from it. Let's think about what homes look like inside as well as outside. The interior of a middle-class home in 1914 is, by modern standards, quite heavily furnished. Victorian and Edwardian taste runs to accumulation, to the filling of every available surface with objects. Photographs in frames, small ornaments, decorative china, embroidered tablecloths. Aspidistras in large pots, wallpaper with elaborate patterns, heavy curtains, layered rugs on top of carpets. The effect is of a room that is entirely, comprehensively, reassuringly full. This taste for accumulation reflects partly the prosperity of the Victorian middle class, which can afford to buy things, and partly a particular Victorian aesthetic that equates fullness with wealth and comfort and respectability. The empty room in this aesthetic is the room of the poor, sparse, and bare because it cannot be filled. The full room is the room of the person who has arrived. The war begins to change this. The 1920s see the emergence of a different aesthetic, one that values simplicity and cleanliness over accumulation and ornament. The modernist aesthetic, as it is developed by architects and designers like Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius and the artists of the Bauhaus, insists that good design should be functional, that ornament is essentially dishonest, that the clean line and the well-made surface are more beautiful and more truthful than the elaborately decorated object. This aesthetic is not simply a product of the war, but the war is one of its conditions. The experience of living with very little in the trench, in the field hospital, in the wartime household stripped of its pre-war luxuries, has demonstrated that life is possible, and even meaningful, without the accumulated decorative weight of the Victorian interior. The ornament is revealed as optional, and for a generation that has seen what the civilization that produced those ornaments was capable of, the gas, the mud, the million dead at the Somme, optional feels like insufficient justification. The stripped-down modernist interior of the 1920s and 1930s, white walls, minimal furniture, clean surfaces, the emphasis on light and space, is among other things an expression of the desire to start fresh, to build a world in which the old accumulations of objects, of conventions, of unexamined assumptions have been cleared away and replaced with something new, something honest, something that does not carry the weight of what went before. The new map, how the war drew the world we live in, the political map of the world in 1914, is different from the political map of 2024 in ways that are almost too numerous to count, but some of the differences are more important than others. And almost all of the most important differences are the result, directly or indirectly, of the First World War. Let's begin with the obvious. In 1914, four great empires dominate the center of the world's political map. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which rules over a bewildering patchwork of nationalities and languages in the heart of Europe. The German Empire, the newest and in some ways the most dynamic of the great powers, united only since 1871, and already the dominant industrial and military power of the continent. The Ottoman Empire, ancient and struggling, ruling over the territories of the modern Middle East and much of North Africa. And the Russian Empire, the largest territorial state in the world, spanning 11 time zones from Poland to the Pacific. By 1923, less than 5 years after the end of the war, all four of these empires have ceased to exist. The German Empire becomes, after the Kaiser's abdication in November 1918, the Weimar Republic, a democratic state struggling to exist in conditions of economic crisis and political polarization that will eventually destroy it. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is dismantled at the Paris Peace Conference into the successor states of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, with the remaining territories distributed to Romania, Italy, and Poland. The Ottoman Empire is defeated, occupied, and eventually replaced by the Turkish Republic, established in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And the Russian Empire is overthrown in two stages, first in the February Revolution of 1917, which creates a democratic provisional government, and then in the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, which creates the Soviet state. The creation of the Soviet Union is perhaps the most important single political consequence of the First World War. Without the war, the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 almost certainly does not happen, at least not in the form it takes. The war destroys the capacity of the Russian state to govern, discredits the provisional government that replaces it, and creates the conditions of chaos and despair in which Lenin's Bolsheviks can seize power with a small, organized force. The Soviet Union lasts until 1991, 74 years. During those 74 years, it defines the shape of the Cold War that dominates global politics from 1945 to 1991. It inspires revolutions in China, Cuba, Vietnam, and elsewhere. It engages in a nuclear arms race with the United States that shapes the strategic reality of the entire second half of the 20th century. It creates a system of governance, communist, authoritarian planned, that is adopted or imposed on roughly a third of the world's population at various points during the 20th century. All of this begins in the winter of 1917, in a Russia exhausted and shattered by 3 years of war that has killed millions of its people and destroyed any remaining confidence in the Tsar and the existing order. Without the war, the Russian Revolution might still have happened eventually. The pressures that produced it were real and growing before 1914, but it would have happened differently, at a different time, under different conditions. The specific Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 is the child of the specific desperation of wartime Russia, and it could only have happened there and then. The Ottoman Empire's dissolution creates the modern Middle East. The territories that were governed by the Ottoman Empire in 1914, what is now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula, are divided after the war by France and Britain in accordance with a secret agreement that was made during the war, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is one of the most consequential and most criticized documents in the history of modern diplomacy. It draws lines across the Middle Eastern map, largely straight lines, without reference to the populations living on either side of them, without meaningful consultation with the Arab leaders who were fighting alongside the British in the hope of independence, and it assigns the resulting territories to French and British administration. The lines of Sykes-Picot create Iraq, a territory that contains, within its arbitrarily drawn borders, Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Kurds, Assyrian Christians, and numerous other groups with different languages, different religions, different loyalties, and no particular history of governing themselves as a single political unit. They create Syria and Lebanon, Palestine and Transjordan on similar principles. The political problems of the modern Middle East, the instability, the conflicts, the violence, the arbitrary states that seem to lack the organic coherence of historical nations, are rooted to a significant degree in the lines drawn in 1916 and 1919. This is not to say that the region had no problems before Sykes-Picot, or that different lines would have created a peaceful and stable Middle East. The situation is more complicated than any simple narrative of imperial wrongdoing can capture. But the First World War, and the peace settlement that followed it, is the moment at which the political structure of the modern Middle East was created, and that political structure has been generating consequences ever since. The post-war peace settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, and the associated treaties with the other Central Powers, is also the creator of modern Germany's most traumatic political experience. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposes on Germany a set of conditions that are, taken together, genuinely harsh. The loss of territory in Europe and all overseas colonies, the limitation of the German military to 100,000 men, the requirement to pay reparations, financial compensation for the damages of the war, in amounts that are debated but are certainly very large, and the infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231, which assigns to Germany and its allies sole responsibility for the war and all its consequences. The reparations and the War Guilt Clause are the provisions that generate the most lasting bitterness in Germany. The reparations burden, which is modified and eventually effectively abandoned over the following years, but which is not clearly settled before the economic crisis of the Great Depression makes its payment impossible, is a constant source of economic and political strain in the Weimar Republic. And the War Guilt Clause, the formal legal assertion that Germany is solely responsible for the war, is experienced by most Germans as a profound injustice, a humiliation imposed by victors who have not examined their own responsibility honestly. This bitterness, the German sense of having been unjustly treated, of having been stabbed in the back by enemies at home and humiliated by enemies abroad, is one of the most important political facts of the interwar years. It is the soil in which Adolf Hitler grows. The specific appeal of Hitler's politics, the promise to restore German honor, to overturn the Versailles settlement, to make Germany powerful again, only works in a population that feels itself humiliated and aggrieved. And that feeling of humiliation and grievance is the direct product of the peace settlement of 1919. Without the First World War, there is no Versailles. Without Versailles, there is no Hitler, or at least not a Hitler with the political appeal that allows him to take power. Without Hitler in power, there is no Second World War, at least not in the form and at the time that it occurs. The Second World War, with its 60 million dead, with the Holocaust, with the atomic bomb, with the division of Europe for half a century, is the child of the first. This is not to say that the First World War directly causes the Second, in the sense that B inevitably follows A. History does not work with that kind of inevitability. There are many contingent events between 1919 and 1939 that might have gone differently, but the First World War creates the conditions, the political geography, the economic strains, the psychological wounds, the unresolved grievances, in which the Second World War becomes possible. The 30 years between 1914 and 1945 are sometimes called the European Civil War, or the Second 30 Years' War, a single catastrophic event with a truce in the middle. This framing is an exaggeration, but it contains a real truth. The two world wars are connected in ways that go beyond the obvious political genealogy. They are connected by the psychological and cultural wound that the First War opened and that the years between the wars were unable to close. The language of after, words that the war gave us. The First World War changes the English language. This is one of those things that seems small but is not. Language is the medium in which we think and feel and communicate, and the changes that a war makes to the language of those who live through it are among the most intimate and lasting of its effects. The war adds words to the language. Some of them are technical, the words for new weapons and new tactics and new equipment. Tank, barrage, dugout, no man's land, shell shock. These words enter the general vocabulary because the things they describe become part of general experience, at least vicariously, through the newspapers and the letters and the stories of those who serve. Some of the words the war adds are words for new concepts that the war makes necessary. Propaganda, in its modern sense, is a word that the war gives currency to. Before 1914, it is a relatively obscure term. By 1918, it describes a major category of deliberate activity that everyone understands and most people distrust. Morale, the psychological state of a body of troops or a civilian population, becomes a word of serious strategic importance during the war, used by military planners and newspaper editors with the same kind of deliberate calculation. Camouflage, previously a military term of limited reach, becomes, during the war, a word in common civilian use. But the most interesting thing the war does to language is not the new words it adds. It is what it does to the emotional charge of existing words. There is a group of words that, before the First World War, carry in the English language a strong positive charge. Words like glory, honor, sacrifice, noble, heroic. These words in 1914 can be used sincerely and without irony. The death of a soldier in battle can be described as a glorious sacrifice and mean something real and unambiguous. The language of patriotic duty, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, as Owen quotes it, is the sincere expression of a sincere belief. By 1918, these words are damaged. Not destroyed, people continue to use them, but damaged, qualified, available to irony in a way they were not before. The poets and the novelists and the memoirists have put too much reality between these grand words and their meanings. The gap between the language of glory and the reality of the trench is too wide to ignore. This damage to the language of grand emotion, this new awareness of the potential gap between what words claim and what reality delivers, is one of the most important and lasting contributions of the First World War to the consciousness of the modern world. The modern sensibility, ironic, distrustful of official language, skeptical of claims made on behalf of collective values, alert to the gap between what is said and what is done, is not entirely the product of the First World War, but the war is a crucial moment in its development. The war teaches on an enormous scale that the language of authority and tradition and patriotism can be used to send young men to die for reasons that those young men might not have endorsed if they had understood them clearly. And once that lesson is learned, it is very hard to unlearn. The advertising language of the 20th century, with its constant, cheerful, deliberately imprecise use of words like freedom and nature and fresh and pure, is navigating around the same damage. The political language of the 20th century, with its elaborate justifications and its careful avoidance of words that have become radioactive, is negotiating with the same damage. The media skepticism of the late 20th and early 21st century, the deep public distrust of official narratives, the assumption that what institutions say is not the same as what they mean, is, in part, the long-term inheritance of the lesson taught in the trenches. And as the night deepens still further, let's look at one more thing, one more quiet revolution. The vote and the voice, how the war changed who was allowed to speak before the First World War. Most women in Britain cannot vote. They have been trying to change this for decades. The suffragette movement, the organizations that campaign for women's suffrage, using tactics that range from peaceful lobbying and public demonstrations to window smashing, arson, and hunger strikes in prison, has been active since the 1860s and increasingly visible and militant since the early 1900s. but before the war, they have not succeeded. The opposition is entrenched, powerful, and not confined to one political party. There are anti-suffragist men across the political spectrum, united by a variety of arguments ranging from the philosophical women's nature makes them unsuitable for political participation, to the practical extending the franchise would be politically disruptive in ways that no party currently in power wants to risk. When the war begins, the major suffragette organization, the WSPU, led by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, suspends its campaign and throws its support behind the war effort. This decision is controversial within the movement, and not all suffragists agree with it. But the mainstream suffragette leadership argues that winning the war must come first, and that demonstrating women's patriotic contribution will strengthen the case for the vote afterward. The war is won. And the contribution is demonstrated in the factories, in the hospitals, in the thousands of women who served in the auxiliary military organizations, in the farms and the offices and the schools and all the other places where women's labor supported the war effort. The contribution is visible, undeniable, documented. In February 1918, while the war is still ongoing, the Representation of the People Act is passed by the British Parliament. It gives the vote to women over 30 who meet certain property qualifications. It is not full equality. Women over 30 with property is a much smaller category than the women who actually worked in the factories and the hospitals, who are mostly younger and mostly without property. The restrictions are deliberate and political. They ensure that the newly enfranchised women are mostly a conservative demographic, unlikely to upset the existing political balance too dramatically. But it is a beginning, and it is a beginning that is clearly connected to the war. The politicians who vote for the act say as much, explicitly. They are giving women the vote because women have earned it through their contribution to the war effort. This framing is problematic in various ways. Women should not need to earn their votes. The right to participate in democracy should not be contingent on wartime service. But as a practical political matter, the war creates the political space for the reform in a way that the pre-war suffragette campaign, for all its energy and sacrifice, had not been able to. In 1928, the Equal Franchise Act extends the vote to all women over 21, on the same basis as men. The process that begins in the munitions factories of 1914 is completed, a decade after the war's end, with full female suffrage. The American experience is parallel. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1920, gives women the right to vote. American suffragists had been campaigning for this since the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, 72 years earlier. The final push that achieves ratification, the political momentum that overcomes the last decade of resistance, comes in part from the war, which demonstrates women's capacity for civic participation in the same way it does in Britain. Germany, France, and most other Western democracies extend women's suffrage in the years immediately following the war, for similar reasons and through similar political dynamics. The extension of women's suffrage is not, of course, a complete solution to the inequality between men and women in public life. Having the vote is not the same as having power. Women vote but still face barriers in standing for office, in being taken seriously as political actors, in influencing the policies that govern their lives. The path from women's suffrage to genuine political equality is long and is still not complete, but the vote matters. It matters because it is the basic recognition of political personhood, the acknowledgement that the views and interests of half the population should be formally included in the processes by which collective decisions are made. And it happens in Britain, in America, in France and Germany and the other Western democracies, in the years immediately after the First World War, because the war makes it politically impossible to continue excluding women from political life. There is a deeper change, harder to measure but perhaps more important in the long run. The war changes what women expect. Not all women, not immediately, not uniformly. The process is gradual and contested and far from complete by the early 1920s. But the women who have spent 4 years running the factories and nursing the wounded and managing households alone, these women have a different sense of their own capabilities and their own rights than their mothers had. They have done things that they were told they could not do. They have managed things that they were told they could not manage. They have discovered in the most practical possible terms that the restrictions on their lives before the war were not natural limitations but political ones. This discovery, quiet, personal, often unspoken, is one of the most important things that the war does. It plants in the minds of millions of women a question that is very hard to unask. If I can do all of this, why couldn't I do it before? And why can't I do it after? The women who ask this question in the 1920s and 1930s are the mothers and grandmothers and teachers of the women who ask it again, more loudly and with more organized support, in the 1960s and 1970s. The second wave of feminism that transforms women's rights in the second half of the 20th century draws on an earlier wave, quieter, less articulate, more confined to the private sphere, that the First World War generated. The long silence, how the war changed the way we remember the First World War, creates an entirely new relationship between a society and its war dead. Before the war, the dead of wars are commemorated, but in specific and limited ways. Generals and officers are remembered by name, in statues, in inscriptions, in the pages of regimental histories. The ordinary soldier, the private and the corporal and the sergeant, is part of an undifferentiated mass. The troops, the fallen, honored in general but not as individuals. The specific person with their name and their face and their particular history disappears into the collective noun. The First World War changes this. The change begins with the problem of the bodies. The scale of the killing, the hundreds of thousands of men who die in single battles, who die in mud that swallows them, who die so far forward that retrieval is impossible, means that a very large proportion of the war dead cannot be identified and returned to their families. They are buried where they fall, in mass graves or individual graves marked only with a temporary wooden cross, in ground that is frequently destroyed by subsequent fighting, until even the graves are gone. The families who receive the notification, the telegram, the form letter from the War Office, the notification that a husband or a son or a brother is dead or missing, often have nowhere to go to mourn. There is no grave to visit, no physical place that contains the physical remains of the person they have lost. The body is in France or in Flanders or in Gallipoli, and it may not be identifiable, and it may never be brought home. This creates an extraordinary social problem. How do you mourn someone you cannot bury? How does a family mark the death of someone whose death has no physical location? The answer that is invented in Britain and in the other Allied countries is the War Memorial. War memorials are not new in 1918. There have been memorials to fallen soldiers in earlier conflicts, but the First World War War Memorial is different in kind from its predecessors. It lists names, every name. Every private and every corporal and every lance corporal, as well as every officer. The War Memorial of a British town or village in the 1920s lists the names of every man from that community who died in the war, without distinction of rank or wealth or family. The name of the gamekeeper is alongside the name of the squire's son. The farm laborer is listed alongside the clergyman. This egalitarianism of death, this insistence that every individual who died is worth naming and remembering by name, is a moral statement. It says that these people mattered not as soldiers, not as members of an army, but as individuals, as persons, as specific human beings who were known to their communities and whose loss is felt specifically and individually. The cenotaph in London's Whitehall, the great stone column that has stood since 1920 as the national memorial of the British war dead, is deliberately empty. Its name means, in Greek, empty tomb. It is a tomb for people who have no tomb, a physical focus for grief that has nowhere else to go. And on Remembrance Sunday each November, the country gathers around its local cenotaphs and war memorials, around those lists of names, in a ceremony of collective memory that was invented in the aftermath of the First World War and that continues in very similar form to the present day. The tomb of the unknown warrior, the grave of an unidentified British soldier, brought from France and buried in Westminster Abbey in November 1920, serves a similar purpose. It is a grave for everyone who has no grave. The Queen lays her bridal bouquet on it. Visiting heads of state lay wreaths at it. It is visited by millions of people over the decades, and for many of them, it is the most powerful place in Britain, because it is the place where grief has a physical location, even if the specific person they grieve is not there. This practice, this careful, dignified, democratic commemoration of individual war dead, is one of the great moral achievements of the post-war years, and it is entirely original. It did not exist before 1914. It was invented in response to the specific and unprecedented problem of mass death in an industrial war, a death so widespread and so randomized. The shell does not choose its target by rank or merit, that the old aristocratic forms of commemoration were clearly inadequate. And this practice, expanded and adapted and applied to subsequent conflicts, shapes how democratic societies relate to their war dead, their veterans, their military obligations to this day. We have traveled a long way together, from the Tuesday morning of 1910, with its horse-drawn carts and its stiff collars and its elaborate hats, through the summer of 1914 and the railway platforms full of men saying goodbye, through the trenches and the factories and the hospitals, through the laboratories where blood banks and antiseptics and synthetic nitrogen are being worked out, through the art studios and the music halls and the editorial offices, through the peace conferences and the redrawn maps and the new constitutions, through the women's meetings and the veterans' hospitals and the rows of white stones in foreign fields. We have tried to see not the war itself, not the battles and the generals and the great decisive moments, but the long, slow, quiet transformation that the war drives in the world around it. And we are not quite done. because there are still a few threads to follow. The world it left behind on plastics, penicillin, and the long ripples of 4 years ambient sound settles into something very steady, a slow, warm hum, like a room at rest. Let's talk about penicillin. Penicillin is discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928. Fleming is a Scottish bacteriologist working at St. Mary's Hospital in London, and what he discovers is that a common mold, Penicillium notatum, produces a substance that kills bacteria. He notices this when a petri dish in his laboratory is accidentally contaminated by the mold, and the bacteria around the contamination are dead. This is not an accident in the trivial sense. Fleming notices it because he is trained to notice it, because he is looking at bacterial cultures with the attention and knowledge of a man who has spent years working on the problem of bacterial infection, a problem that the First World War placed at the center of medicine with terrible urgency. Fleming served in the Royal Army Medical Corps during the war. He worked in a field laboratory in Boulogne, watching soldiers die of wound infections. He was deeply motivated by the problem of infection, not just technically interested, but personally, morally motivated by the thousands of deaths he had witnessed. The specific direction of his research after the war, his focus on bactericidal agents, his interest in the substances that could kill bacteria without harming the body, is shaped by what he saw in France. Penicillin is not fully developed as a clinical drug until 1941. There are technical problems with purifying and concentrating it that take years to solve, and the work is done not by Fleming, but by a team at Oxford led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain. But even the Oxford development is driven by the urgency of war. It is the Second World War, beginning in 1939, that creates the pressure to develop penicillin quickly enough that it can save lives in the current conflict. The development of penicillin, the first true antibiotic, transforms medicine more completely than perhaps any other single discovery. Before penicillin, bacterial infection is a death sentence in many cases. After penicillin, many previously fatal infections become treatable, and life expectancy in the developed world begins to rise toward the levels we now take for granted. The entire class of antibiotic drugs that defines modern medicine begins here, with a mold in a petri dish, in the laboratory of a man who spent the First World War watching soldiers die of preventable infections. The war also changes how people communicate. Before the war, long-distance communication is primarily written. The telegraph can send short messages quickly, but it is expensive and not universally available. The telephone exists and is beginning to spread, but in 1914 it is still primarily a business and professional tool, not something that ordinary households have. Most communication over distance is by letter, carefully written, carefully read, preserved, and reread in ways that the instantaneous communications of the modern world are not. The war creates an extraordinary demand for communication. Commanders need to communicate with each other. Governments need to communicate with their forces in the field. And the millions of soldiers and their families at home need to communicate with each other across the distances created by the war. The letter, the handwritten, censored, delayed letter, becomes, for the duration of the war, the primary means by which the personal and emotional connections of a society are maintained across the separation that war creates. The postal systems of all the belligerent powers operate at scales they were never designed for, carrying billions of letters through the war years. The writing of letters becomes a daily practice for millions of people who before the war wrote letters only occasionally. This enforced practice of letter writing, this daily discipline of sitting down and putting thought into words and putting words on paper, is, for many people, genuinely transformative. They become more articulate. They become more aware of their own feelings, because writing is a form of thinking, and thinking about feelings is a way of understanding them. The letter written by a semi-literate soldier to his family, struggling to find words for something that has no adequate words, is doing the same thing that Wilfred Owen is doing in his poems, trying to make language adequate to experience. The radio is the other communication revolution that the war accelerates. Wireless telegraphy, the transmission of messages without wires, using radio waves, is demonstrated by Guglielmo Marconi in 1895 and developed rapidly in the years before the war for maritime communication. By 1914, ship-to-shore radio communication is standard, and the great passenger liners crossing the Atlantic carry radio operators who can send and receive messages. The war creates an enormous demand for radio communication between military units, between naval vessels, between aircraft and their ground stations. The technology is developed rapidly, the equipment becomes more reliable and more powerful, and the number of people who work with radio equipment and understand its principles expands enormously. After the war, this expanded base of knowledge and interest leads directly to the development of commercial radio broadcasting. The first regular radio broadcasts to the general public begin in 1920, and by the mid-1920s, radio is a mass medium in America and Britain, with millions of households owning receivers and listening to music, news, drama, and comedy. Radio changes everyday life in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate now, when radio is a familiar and somewhat taken for granted medium. For the household that has never before had access to live music, to the sound of an orchestra or a dance band or a comedian performing in real time, the radio is a genuinely extraordinary experience. It brings the city into the countryside. It brings cultural events into working-class homes that could not afford to attend them in person. It connects dispersed communities to a shared stream of experience and information. The politician who grasps what radio can do, who understands that it is possible, for the first time in history, to speak simultaneously to millions of people, in their own homes, in an intimate and personal register, has a political tool of unprecedented power. Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, Winston Churchill's wartime broadcasts, Adolf Hitler's use of radio to maintain the emotional intensity of his relationship with the German public. All of these are possible because of radio, and radio is developed to mass market readiness because of the First World War. Let's talk about plastics one more time, more completely. We mentioned Bakelite in the context of buttons, but the story is much larger than buttons. The First World War creates a huge demand for materials with specific properties, lightweight, strong, electrically insulating, chemically resistant, that natural materials cannot always supply in adequate quantities. The war drives research into synthetic materials across a wide range: synthetic rubber, synthetic dyes, synthetic fibers, synthetic plastics. After the war, the chemical companies that have been built up to supply these wartime demands continue to develop synthetic materials. Nylon, the first fully synthetic fiber, with the strength of silk and the practicality of cotton, is developed by DuPont in 1935, building on chemical research that the war had accelerated. Nylon changes clothing, the nylon stocking, parachutes, the nylon parachute, toothbrushes, the nylon bristle, and dozens of other products. Polyethylene, the material from which plastic bags, plastic bottles, plastic film, and 1,000 other ubiquitous products are made, is discovered in 1933 by accident at ICI, the British chemical company built partly from wartime foundations. PVC, polyvinyl chloride, used in pipes and flooring and electrical insulation, is developed in the 1920s and 1930s from research that builds on the wartime expansion of the chemical industry. The world of plastic that we live in, the world in which plastic is so pervasive that it is found in the ocean floor and in human bloodstreams, and in the remotest corners of every ecosystem on Earth, begins with the wartime expansion of the chemical industry and the subsequent decades of synthetic material development that the war made possible. This is not an uncomplicated legacy. Plastic is an environmental catastrophe as well as a material revolution. The same properties that make it so useful, its durability, its resistance to chemical breakdown, make it persist in the environment for centuries after its useful life is over. The plastic problem that modern civilization struggles with is the long-term cost of the material revolution that the First World War helped drive. The soft revolution of the everyday, daylight saving, tea breaks, and the small gifts of a terrible time. Not all of the First World War's legacies are grand or tragic or world historical. Some of them are small. Some of them are the kinds of things you encounter in your daily life without any particular awareness that they have a history at all. Daylight saving time. Daylight saving time, the practice of moving clocks forward in spring and back in autumn, so that the longer daylight hours of summer are better aligned with the working day, is introduced during the First World War. The idea is much older. Benjamin Franklin wrote about it in a satirical essay in 1784. The New Zealand entomologist George Hudson proposed a practical version in 1895. But it is the war, and specifically the German desire to conserve coal by reducing the need for artificial lighting during the long summer evenings, that turns the idea into policy. Germany and Austria-Hungary introduced daylight saving time in April 1916. Britain follows in May 1916. The other belligerent nations follow through 1916 and 1917. The United States introduces it in 1918 as part of the Standard Time Act. After the war, most countries abandoned daylight saving time because the wartime coal conservation emergency is over. But it is readopted in most of the same countries during the Second World War for the same reasons, and this time it largely sticks. The biannual clock changing that is still practiced in most of North America and Europe, that still generates twice annual complaints about disrupted sleep schedules and arguments about whether the agricultural lobby does or does not benefit from it. All of this traces directly to a German energy conservation measure of 1916, the tea break. The British tea break, the mid-morning and mid-afternoon pause in the working day for a cup of tea, is not invented by the First World War, but it is regularized and formalized by it. Before the war, breaks in the working day vary widely between industries and workplaces. Some factories have them, some do not. There is no standard provision for rest breaks in British industrial practice. During the war, the munitions factories that employ women and men in round-the-clock production schedules discover something important. People who have regular breaks work better than people who do not. The physiological research that is conducted on factory workers during the war, part of the broader scientific management of labor that the war drive, demonstrates that a short rest break increases productivity more than it costs in lost working time. The tea break becomes a standard feature of the British factory and office in the interwar years, formalized in ways it was not before the war. And tea, the drink that is prepared and consumed during this break, becomes even more centrally embedded in British culture than it was before, which is remarkable given that it was already quite central. The British relationship with tea is a long story with many chapters. Tea has been drunk in Britain since the 17th century. By the 19th century, it is the national drink across all classes, drunk at all times of day, hot and sweet and with milk. The tea ration is one of the most carefully maintained provisions of the wartime rationing system. When almost everything else is restricted, the government is extremely cautious about restricting tea, because the social and psychological importance of the tea break to the working population is understood, at some level, by everyone with the power to restrict it. After the war, the tea break is essentially permanent. It is written into employment practices, argued over in industrial negotiations, protected by unions as a working condition. It is one of the small but genuine contributions of the wartime munitions industry to the daily texture of British working life, the wristwatch. Before the First World War, most men who carry a watch carry a pocket watch, a round metal-cased clock worn on a chain, kept in the waistcoat pocket, consulted by being drawn out and opened. The wristwatch exists, but it is considered a female accessory, a delicate thing, worn on the wrist, impractical for the vigorous outdoor activities that men are supposed to engage in. The war changes this. Men who are managing artillery barrages or coordinating infantry attacks need to check the time quickly, with both hands free, under conditions where it is impossible to reach into a pocket and draw out a watch on a chain. The wristwatch, accurate, strapped firmly to the wrist, readable with a glance, is the practical solution. The officers of the First World War adopt the wristwatch as a practical military accessory, and many of them bring the habit home. The returned officer who wears a wristwatch rather than a pocket watch is, by 1920, not eccentric but fashionable. The association with military service gives the wristwatch a masculine credibility it previously lacked. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the wristwatch gradually replaces the pocket watch as the standard timepiece for men of all classes, and by the 1940s, the pocket watch is primarily an heirloom rather than an everyday object. The wristwatch, which remains the standard personal timepiece until the smartphone began to replace it in the early 21st century, is on your wrist because of the coordination requirements of artillery bombardment in 1916. Zip fasteners, disposable razors, sanitary napkins, blood types used routinely in hospitals, plastic surgery as a recognized medical specialty, prosthetic limbs designed with genuine ingenuity and care, occupational therapy. Rehabilitation medicine, the conscientious objector as a legally recognized category, the concept of post-traumatic stress as a real and treatable condition, the idea that governments have a responsibility for the veterans of their wars. All of these have roots in the First World War. All of these are part of the slow, quiet, accumulating transformation that the war drives in the texture of daily life, in the organization of medicine, in the relationship between individuals and the state, in the assumptions we carry about what we are owed and what we owe. The war was not fought for these things. Nobody in August 1914 looked at the gathering storm and thought, "This will give us zip fasteners and wristwatches and blood banks and synthetic fertilizer, and jazz and daylight saving time and female suffrage and the germ of the welfare state." Nobody planned these things or intended them. They arose like all the most significant changes in history, from the complex, unplannable intersection of millions of human decisions and the strange feedback loops of technology and politics and culture and chance. The war was terrible. This must be said plainly, even in a quiet story like this one. The scale of suffering that the First World War represents, the 10 million dead soldiers, the 7 million dead civilians, the 20 million wounded, the 50 or 100 million dead of the subsequent pandemic, the political catastrophes that follow from it, is not to be softened or made comfortable. The war is the greatest collective failure of European civilization in the modern era, and possibly the greatest preventable catastrophe in human history, but terrible things leave traces. And some of the traces they leave, not all of them, but some are things that, in ways that no one planned and no one could have predicted, made the world that came after more humane, more capable, more aware of what human beings can do and what they owe to each other. That is not a justification of the war. There is no justification, but it is the truth of it, and the truth is worth knowing, because the truth is how we understand the world we live in. The fire goes quiet, a slow and gentle closing. It is evening now somewhere, or it is very early morning, the moment before the light changes, the moment in which a room is the most itself, most quiet, most settled. We have been traveling together for a long time, through the horse-drawn mornings of 1910 and the crowded platforms of 1914, through the mud and the hospitals and the factories, through the laboratories and the studios and the council chambers, through the cemeteries, very slowly, reading the names, through the decades after, watching the world that the war built take shape and settle into the form that we have inherited. And we have arrived here, in a world that is still shaped, in dozens of ways that are now invisible because they are familiar, by 4 years of war that happened more than 100 years ago. The blood bank in your nearest hospital, built on principles worked out in tents in France in 1917. The nitrogen in the food on your table, produced by a process perfected under the pressure of a naval blockade. The antibiotics you take when you have an infection, developed by a man who spent years watching soldiers die of preventable infections in a field hospital in Boulogne. The democratic right of women to vote, expanded in the years immediately following the war, because the war had made exclusion politically untenable. The plastic in almost everything you touch descended from the synthetic materials industry that the war built. The radio that still exists, the aviation that the war launched, the modern map of countries that the war drew, the psychological vocabulary with which we understand trauma and stress and the injuries that are not visible, all of it shaped, somewhere in its history, by 4 years of mud and noise and extraordinary human effort. You have been here the whole time. Moving through a world whose shape was determined, in so many small and large ways, by something that most people living in it have not thought about very much because it happened before they were born. History is like that. It works in the background. It shapes the furniture of the present, the arrangements of power and technology and habit and assumption that we take for granted without announcing itself. It requires a kind of attention, a kind of willingness to slow down and look, to become visible at all. And that is what we have been doing tonight, looking. Let's stay here for a while, in the quiet of this late hour, in the comfortable weight of a long story, nearly finished, settling around us like the end of a fire. The world of 1914, the world of the horse-drawn morning and the stiff collar and the elaborate hat and the long skirt and the coffee house and the Sunday joint, that world is gone. It ended not all at once, but gradually and then more quickly, in the 4 years in the aftermath of the First World War. The world that replaced it, our world, or the beginning of our world, is the world that the war in its long and terrible transformation produced, more democratic in some ways, more scientifically advanced, more materially comfortable for more people, more aware of the capacity of governments and institutions for both service and cruelty, more cautious about the language of glory and heroism, more willing, at least sometimes, to count the dead and say their names. It is not a perfect world. The war produced things that are genuinely terrible as well as things that are genuinely good. The map it drew still causes suffering. The political movements it helped generate still cast shadows. The environmental costs of the industrial and chemical transformations it drove are still being calculated. The trauma it inflicted on entire generations was never fully healed, but it is the world we have. And understanding how we got it, sitting with the quiet, unheroic, unglamorous, essential truth of how complicated change happens, how it accumulates slowly from 1,000 small decisions and 1,000 unintended consequences, that understanding seems worth something. It seems worth a long, quiet evening. Outside, if it is night where you are, the stars are where they always are. The fire, if there is one, is low and warm and steady. The things that are important are what they always were. The connections we make, the work we do, the care we give, the attention we bring to the world and to the people in it. The war was a century ago. The world it made is the world we live in. And the world we live in can still be changed. Quietly, slowly, stubbornly, the way the best changes always happen, by the same kinds of ordinary effort, ordinary care, and ordinary human ingenuity that remade the world in the 4 years after 1914. That is not a comfortable thought, exactly, but it is a sustaining one. Thank you for staying with this. Thank you for your patience with the long story, the slow pace, the willingness to sit with history the way you might sit with a river, not rushing it, not demanding that it arrive anywhere particular, just watching it move. If you find yourself here again in the late hours in need of a quiet voice telling a long story, there will be more stories here, told the same way at the same unhurried pace. For now, rest well. The world has been changing for a very long time, and it will keep changing while you sleep.